There is a particular kind of dread that has nothing to do with armies or catastrophes. It is quiet. It is personal. It is the dread that settles into your chest when you realise you have lost something that was not yours to lose. It is the sinking feeling that arrives not with the sound of trumpets or the thunder of consequence, but with a single, hollow splash. The kind of sound that means something is gone, something borrowed, something owed. Tonight, we travel back more than 2,800 years to a stretch of muddy riverbank along the Jordan, a place where no kings gathered, no armies marched, and no prophet called down fire from heaven, a place where ordinary men picked up axes and went to work, and yet on this unremarkable morning, in this undramatic hour, something happened that has echoed through 3 millennia of human memory. Not because it was loud, not because it was grand, but because it was small and because the God of the universe noticed. This is the story of the floating axe head. This is the story of what happens when you cry out not over kingdoms, but over a single lost thing. This is the story of a miracle so quiet that only a handful of tired workers ever saw it happen. Close your eyes, slow your breathing. Let us walk together to the edge of the river. Section 1. A season of growth. The community expands. To understand the miracle, you first have to understand the world in which it happened. The prophet Elisha lived and ministered during the reign of the kings of Israel, a turbulent era of divided kingdoms, shifting alliances and spiritual upheaval. Israel had long since fractured into 2 separate kingdoms following the death of Solomon. The northern kingdom, simply called Israel, had drifted far from the religious traditions of its ancestors. Idol worship was common. The prophets of God were often marginalised, persecuted or ignored. It was into this world that the great prophet Elijah had come, a man of fire and confrontation, and it was from Elijah's legacy that Elisha emerged, inheriting a double portion of his mentor's spirit after the older man was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. Where Elijah had been dramatic, confrontational and filled with divine fire, Elisha carried something different, a quieter power, more intimate, more domestic in its expression. Elisha was the prophet who came to you. He was not the prophet who stood on mountaintops and called down rain. He was the prophet who visited your home, restored your dead child to life, purified your poisoned stew, and multiplied your oil when your creditors came knocking. Around Elisha gathered a community known as the Sons of the Prophets, a loose fellowship of men who had dedicated their lives to the prophetic tradition. Some scholars describe them as a prophetic school. Others see them as a kind of spiritual brotherhood or guild. They were not kings or priests. They were ordinary men of faith, living lives of service, study and devotion in a world that often did not make space for such things. And this community was growing. It is one of the most quietly encouraging details in all of Scripture. In a time of national spiritual decline, the community of people devoted to God was not shrinking. It was expanding. New men were coming. New hearts were turning. The fellowship that had formed around the prophetic tradition was becoming too large for its current housing. Think about what this means for a moment. When the broader culture drifts away from the sacred, there are always those who drift toward it. There are always those who feel the pull of something deeper, something more real than what the world is offering. In every dark age, there are small communities of light, not always visible, not always celebrated, who simply keep going. The Sons of the Prophets was such a community. Their current dwelling, the text does not tell us exactly where it was located, but tradition places it near Gilgal or Jericho, had become too cramped for their growing numbers. This was not a crisis. It was a blessing. They were outgrowing their walls because there were more of them now. More men had come. More lives had been given over to the prophetic calling. And so the community did what any growing group of practical, faithful people would do. They proposed a solution. They came to Elisha, their teacher, their guide, their connection to the divine, and made a simple request. "Let us go to the Jordan River," they said. "There we can cut timber. There we can build ourselves a larger place to live." The request was humble. It was reasonable. It was the kind of request that comes from people who are not waiting for God to rain furniture from the sky, but who are willing to pick up their tools and build what they need, while still seeking their teacher's blessing before they begin. Elisha's response was simple. Go. One word. Permission granted. The plan was good. The work was approved. Let us go. But then one of the men added something. A small addendum. A gentle plea. Please, he said. Please come with us. And Elisha, the prophet of Israel, the man who had parted the Jordan River, who had healed Naaman of leprosy, who had seen armies of angelic chariots surrounding the hills, this man said yes, he would go with them. Not because he was needed for the physical labour, not because he had architectural expertise, but because when his people asked him to be present, he chose presence over distance. There is something worth sitting with in that detail. The greatest among them chose to go with them. He did not remain in his quarters, elevated and separate. He walked down to the river with men who were going to sweat and blister their hands on rough wood. He was present for the ordinary work, and so the journey began. The sons of the prophets set out toward the Jordan River, their axes on their shoulders, their teacher walking among them, the morning light beginning to touch the land around them. They did not know what was about to happen. They had no reason to expect anything unusual. They were just going to do some work. Section 2. Ordinary work, the dignity of building. There is a theology of ordinary work that the modern world is always in danger of forgetting. We tend to divide life into the sacred and the secular, the moments of prayer and the moments of labour, the time in the sanctuary and the time on the job site. But the ancient world, and particularly the Hebrew tradition, did not always draw this line so sharply. Work was worship. Building was holy. The sweat of honest labour was not something that needed to be apologised for or set aside when one turned toward God. It was itself a form of devotion. Consider the men walking toward the Jordan that morning. These were not kings. They were not high priests performing elaborate sacrificial rites in the temple. They were men with calloused hands and worn sandals, men who had given their lives to the prophetic tradition, not because it was glamorous or profitable, but because they believed in something that could not be bought or sold. And now they were going to cut wood. The Jordan River Valley was, in ancient times, a place of remarkable ecological abundance. The riverbanks were lined with dense vegetation, tamarisk trees, willows, reeds, and thickets of thorny undergrowth. Further back, the hills and plains surrounding the valley held timber that could be harvested for construction. It was a practical choice for a building project. The river provided both the timber resource and a natural boundary that gave the location a sense of definition. We can imagine the scene with some vividness. The morning air along the Jordan would have been cool and damp, carrying the smell of water and wet earth. The sounds would have been the sounds of nature. Birds calling from the reeds, water moving over stones, the distant bleating of animals in the hills, and then the sounds of men at work, the dull, rhythmic thudding of axes against wood, the crack and crash of timber falling, the grunting effort of men lifting and hauling, the murmur of voices, conversation, perhaps laughter in the morning light. There is something profoundly human about this scene. It is the sound of community. It is the sound of people building something together, not for themselves alone, but for the group, for the fellowship, for the generations that would come after them and need a place to gather. Each man had his own section of work. Each man had taken his axe and moved to his chosen tree. The work had spread out along the riverbank, the sound of chopping rising and falling from different points in the tree line. And Elisha was there among them. The scripture is quiet about exactly what he was doing in these moments. Perhaps he was overseeing the work, moving from man to man with guidance or encouragement. Perhaps he was simply present, a witness, a companion, a source of calm authority that made the work feel less like labour and more like purpose. The sons of the prophets worked in the way that faithful people have always worked, with their bodies engaged and their hearts somewhere deeper. This was not mindless toil. This was intentional building. Every swing of the axe was a contribution to something larger than the moment, a future dwelling where men would continue to gather, study, pray, and carry forward the flame of prophetic faith. For a while, everything was ordinary. Everything was good. The timber was coming down. The work was progressing. The morning was passing in the way that mornings of honest labour often pass. Not quickly, because the work was hard, but not slowly either, because the work had meaning. And then it happened. The smallest catastrophe you can imagine. The kind that stops everything. Section 3. The sudden crisis. Iron in dark water. One of the men was working close to the water's edge. We do not know his name. The scripture, in its characteristic economy of detail, does not tell us who he was. He was one among the company, one of the sons of the prophets, a man who had walked down to the Jordan that morning with the same sense of purpose and community that all the others carried. He raised his axe, he brought it down, and the iron head flew off the handle. In the physics of the moment, we can reconstruct what happened with some precision. Ancient axe heads were fitted onto wooden handles through a socket. The handle was inserted into a hole in the metal head. Over time, with repeated use, the wood could loosen within the socket. The repeated impact of chopping, the vibrations that travelled up and down the handle with every blow, the swelling and contracting of the wood with moisture, all of these forces conspired over time to work the handle loose. When the axe head separated, it did not just fall straight down. The momentum of the swing sent it flying in an arc, outward, over the water, and then gravity took it, and the Jordan River received it. The sound would have been brief, a single splash, the dark water closing over the iron with barely a ripple, and then silence where the tool had been. The man stood on the bank holding nothing but a handle, a stick with no head, useless in his hand. For a moment perhaps he just stared at the water. The mind in such moments sometimes goes very quiet before the panic sets in. There is a strange suspended second between the event and the full understanding of its consequences, a heartbeat where the brain has registered what happened, but the chest has not yet responded. And then the understanding arrived. The axe head had sunk. Iron does not float. In the murky, fast-moving current of the Jordan, an iron axe head would have gone straight to the riverbed and settled into the silt and stones at the bottom. There was no retrieving it through normal means. The river was not the kind of water you could simply wade into and feel around for a small piece of metal. The current was real. The depth was uncertain. The visibility in ancient riverbeds was essentially nothing. The axe head was gone. But this is where the detail that makes this story so much more than a simple accident becomes important. Because the man's first response was not just frustration or inconvenience. His first response was something far more weighted and far more revealing of his character. The axe was borrowed. In the ancient world, iron was extraordinarily valuable. We are not talking about a world where iron tools were common commodities available at any market. The Iron Age had come to Canaan, but iron objects, particularly worked iron tools like axe heads, were not cheap or easily replaced. They were expensive. They were precious. They were the kind of object that a man might own only a few of in his entire life, or might not own at all. When this man had come to join the work party at the Jordan, he had not had his own axe. Someone, another member of the community, a neighbour, a friend, had trusted him with theirs. He had accepted that trust. He had shouldered that responsibility. And he had walked down to the river carrying not just a tool but an obligation. And now the obligation was sitting at the bottom of the Jordan River. The weight of that moment would have been immense. Not just the practical weight of loss, the replacement cost of the tool, the explanation that would have to be made, the apology that would have to be offered. But the deeper weight of having failed someone who trusted you, the weight of borrowed responsibility that you could no longer fulfill. This is a weight that every human being knows. Not everyone has lost an axe head in a river, but everyone has lost something that was not entirely theirs to lose. Everyone has broken something borrowed. Everyone has failed to honour a trust that was placed in them. The man on the riverbank was not just an ancient labourer having a bad morning. He was a human being experiencing one of the most universal of human distresses, the sinking knowledge that something is lost, that the loss carries consequences beyond himself, and that he cannot fix it on his own. He cried out. Section 4, the cry for help, the theology of small prayers. The words he used are recorded in the scripture with a simplicity that makes them almost unbearably human. Alas, my master, it was borrowed. 4 words in the original Hebrew, or close to it. The exact phrasing varies slightly across translations, but the emotional content is consistent across all of them. A man crying out to the person he trusts most, not with a request for a miracle, not with a theological appeal, but with the naked admission of a problem. It was borrowed. There is no dramatic rhetorical framing here. There is no lengthy explanation. There is no attempt to minimise or deflect. The man simply named the thing that made the loss most grievous. It was not his to lose. He had been trusted with it, and now it was gone. Notice what he did not say. He did not say that the loss was unfair. He did not say that the handle was defective, or that the working conditions near the riverbank were unreasonable. He did not make excuses. He did not blame anyone else. He simply said, it was borrowed. Here is the problem. Here is why the problem matters beyond the physical loss itself. I am responsible for something I can no longer account for. There is profound spiritual depth in this small moment of honesty. The sons of the prophets were men who had devoted themselves to a life of integrity and devotion. For this man, the loss of a borrowed tool was not merely inconvenient. It was a matter of honour, of character, of keeping his word and fulfilling his obligations. The fact that the loss was accidental did not entirely remove the burden of it. He had accepted the responsibility of the borrowed tool, and now that tool was gone. His cry to Elisha is a model, in miniature, of what prayer often looks like in its most honest form. Not formal, not elaborate, not carefully constructed, just a cry. Just a voice lifted toward the one who might be able to help. Just the bare admission. Here is what happened, here is what it means, and I cannot fix it. The scripture does not tell us what expression was on Elisha's face when he heard the cry, but it tells us everything we need to know through what he did next. He did not dismiss the concern. He did not say, it is just an axe head. He did not say, we will get you another one, do not worry about it. He did not point out that the man should have been more careful, or that they could continue the work without him. He did not retreat into the kind of spiritual aloofness that might have allowed him to say, God has more important matters than your tool. Elisha turned his attention fully toward the problem. He asked a single question. Where did it fall? Section 5. The prophet's response. The geography of grace. Where did it fall? It is such a practical question. It is almost startlingly ordinary for a prophet to ask. Not. What is your faith level? Not. Have you prayed about this? Not. What does this loss signify spiritually? Just. Where did it fall? In those 3 words, Elisha communicated something extraordinary about the nature of divine care. He was not distant. He was not abstract. He was not operating in a realm of spiritual principle so elevated that the specific geography of a lost axe head was beneath his attention. He wanted to know exactly where. He wanted the coordinates of the crisis, however small. There is a remarkable pastoral wisdom in this. When someone comes to you in distress, even distress over something that might seem minor by comparison to the great troubles of the world, the first thing they need is not a sermon. It is not a theological framework. It is not a reminder that worse things have happened to other people. The first thing they need is for someone to ask, where did it fall? Where exactly is the problem? Help me understand the specific shape of what has gone wrong. Elisha was doing what the best pastors, the best friends, the best leaders always do. He was locating the problem before attempting to address it. He was paying attention. He was taking the man's distress seriously enough to want to understand its precise nature. The man showed him the place. Perhaps he pointed at the water. Perhaps he walked Elisha to the spot on the bank where he had been working. where the axe head had left his hands in that disastrous arc. Perhaps he said, "Right there, just past that bend, near those reeds." And Elisha looked at the water. We do not know what passed through Elisha's mind in that moment. The scripture does not give us access to his inner experience. But we know what he did next. He cut off a stick, just a stick, a branch of wood, the same material he was surrounded by, the same raw material that the sons of the prophets had been gathering all morning for their building project. He did not call for sacred objects or special instruments. He did not perform elaborate ritual preparations. He did not even appear to pray out loud, at least not in any way the scripture records. He cut a stick and he threw it into the water. In that moment, Elisha was operating at the intersection of the physical and the divine, using the simplest possible material action as the point of contact for something that transcended physics entirely. The stick was not magic. Wood does not make iron float. But the act of throwing the stick was an act of prophetic intention, a declaration made in the physical language of the material world that something was about to be different. And then the iron floated. Section 6. The miracle. Iron upon the surface. Let us sit with the strangeness of this for a moment. Iron does not float. This is not a matter of ancient misunderstanding or pre-scientific confusion. The people of the ancient Near East understood perfectly well that iron sinks in water. They worked with iron, they forged it, they traded it. They knew its properties with the intimate familiarity that comes from daily practical use. When the scripture records this event, it is not recording something that the original audience might have thought was merely unusual or somewhat unlikely. It is recording something they would have immediately understood as impossible. The density of iron is approximately 7.87 grams per cubic centimetre. The density of water is 1 gram per cubic centimetre. This means iron is nearly 8 times denser than water. Without some form of external force, buoyancy created by hollow construction, or deliberate engineering to capture air, a piece of solid iron will always sink. This is not a close call. This is not a borderline case where the right conditions might make it work. Iron sinks, period. And yet the iron floated. The scripture uses a simple verb. It rose, or it came to the surface. The Hebrew is terse and factual, as if the writer is not trying to dramatize the event but simply report it accurately. The iron rose to the surface of the water. This is the character of miracles as they are often recorded in scripture, particularly in the Elisha narratives. They are not described with breathless amazement. They are reported as facts. Here is what happened. The axe head floated. Record it and move on. There is something almost more unsettling about that restraint than dramatic description would be. It suggests that for those who lived in close proximity to the divine presence, for Elisha, who walked in the power of the Spirit daily, the suspension of natural law was not something to be gawked at or endlessly analysed. It was simply what happened when God chose to intervene. It was reality, just reality of a different order. But for the man standing on the bank, for the man who had cried out in his distress, the man who had said it was borrowed, the sight of that iron head rising through the water must have been something he never forgot for the rest of his life. There is a particular quality to the restoration of something that you had given up as permanently lost. If you have ever believed something was gone forever, a relationship, a hope, a possession of great significance, and then seen it return to you through means you cannot explain, you understand something of what that man must have felt standing at the edge of the Jordan. The thing he thought was gone forever was coming back to him. The water was giving it up. The river which had swallowed the tool with such finality was now releasing it. The surface of the Jordan broke around the iron head as it rose, and there it was, wet, dark, gleaming in the morning light, floating as calmly as if it had never sunk at all. No crowd had gathered to witness it. No trumpets announced it. No herald went out to tell the kings of Israel what had happened on the riverbank that morning. The sons of the prophets were close by, but the scripture suggests the moment was intimate. Elisha the man and the water between them. Miracles in the Elisha stories have this quality again and again. They happen at close range. They happen between specific people in specific moments of specific need. They're not the kind of miracles that require an audience. They are the kind that happen because God noticed someone's distress and God cared. Elisha looked at the floating iron head, and then he said to the man the simplest possible thing, "Reach out your hand and take it." And the man reached out, and he took it from the water, and the axe head was his again, or rather, was the rightful owner's again, in his hands, his obligation restored, his borrowed debt discharged, and the work resumed, just like that. Section 7. Restoration. The weight returned. Notice the final movement of the miracle. Elisha did not pick up the axe head himself. He did not have it brought to him so that he could present it ceremonially to the man. He did not make the restoration a moment of prophetic theatre. He told the man to take it. This is a detail that deserves careful attention, because it is deeply consistent with a pattern that runs through the Elisha narratives and through the broader biblical understanding of what miracles are for. The miracle did not replace the man's agency. It restored the conditions necessary for his agency to function. It brought the axe head back to where he could reach it, and then left the reaching to him. The man had to stretch out his hand. He had to make that final motion. He had to participate in his own restoration. There is a theology here about the nature of divine help that is subtle but important. God does not typically do for us what we can do for ourselves once the impossible obstacle has been removed. The sea parts, but the Israelites still have to walk through it. The water turns to wine, but the servants still have to fill the jars. The bread multiplies, but the disciples still have to distribute it. The miracle creates the possibility. The human act completes it. When the man's hand closed around the wet iron of the axe head, something more than a tool was returned to him. His standing was restored. The weight of his borrowed obligation, the weight he had been carrying from the moment of the loss, the weight that had driven him to cry out, was lifted. He could now return what had been lent to him. He could now look the man who had trusted him in the eye and say, "Here is your axe, whole and unharmed." The honour he thought was lost had come back to him through water, and now the work could resume. The axe head was refitted to its handle. We can imagine the simple practical actions that followed: drying the iron, reseating it on the wood, testing the weight of it. And then the sound of chopping began again, the rhythm of work restored, the building project continuing as if the interruption had been nothing more than a brief pause. But it had not been nothing. Something had happened here that would be remembered. Something had happened that would be recorded in Scripture and read by human beings more than 2,000 years later, in a world that would have seemed utterly fantastical to the men on the bank of the Jordan that morning. Why? Why was this small story worth preserving? Why, out of the countless events of Elisha's ministry, did this particular moment find its way into the canon of sacred scripture alongside the great dramas of kings and nations? Perhaps because it tells us something that the great dramas cannot tell us. Perhaps because it answers a question that matters to ordinary people more than any question about kings. Does God notice small things? Does God care about borrowed tools and personal shame and the quiet distress of unremarkable people doing unremarkable work on an unremarkable morning? The answer, written in the record of the floating axe head, is yes. Yes, he does. Section 8. Deeper spiritual meaning, the archaeology of the ordinary. To fully understand what this story meant and means, we need to set it in its broader theological context. The Elisha narratives in the Book of 2 Kings are a remarkable collection of stories that share a distinctive character. They are not primarily about national politics, though politics forms the backdrop. They are not primarily about grand theological pronouncements or dramatic confrontations with idolatry, though those elements appear as well. They are primarily about ordinary people in ordinary circumstances encountering the extraordinary care of God. the widow whose oil kept multiplying until she had enough to pay her debts and save her sons from slavery, the Shunammite woman whose dead child was restored to life, the servants whose poisoned stew was made safe to eat, the 100 men fed from a small provision of bread that was more than enough, the Syrian general Naaman, whose pride had to be broken before his leprosy could be healed, and the man whose borrowed axe head sank in the Jordan. What all of these stories share is a theological insistence. God's power and God's attention are not reserved for kings and generals and national crises. They extend downward, or perhaps more accurately they extend outward, into the texture of ordinary human life, into debt, into grief, into hunger, into sickness, into the very specific, very personal distress of a man standing on a riverbank holding a useless stick. The borrowed axe head is particularly rich as a symbol precisely because it combines two things that human beings universally experience: the weight of obligation to others and the helplessness of certain kinds of loss. Borrowed things carry a special kind of anxiety. When something belongs to you, its loss is painful, but it is your pain. When something belongs to someone else, its loss is both your pain and your shame. You feel the weight of the other person's trust, the memory of their generosity and lending, the knowledge that your carelessness, however involuntary, has cost them something. This is also, the theologians have noted, a picture of the human situation in a broader sense. We live in a world that has been lent to us. The bodies we inhabit, the gifts and abilities we carry, the time we have been given, none of it is ultimately ours. We are stewards of borrowed things, and the awareness of that can produce in sensitive souls a particular kind of existential anxiety. What if I cannot return what I have been given? What if I lose what was trusted to me? The floating axe head says, even that kind of loss is not beyond recovery. Even the thing that sank, the thing that seemed irretrievably gone into darkness and depth, can be raised, can be restored, can be placed back in your hands. This is why the story has resonated across so many centuries and so many cultures. It is not about axes. It is about the human terror of irreversible loss and the divine insistence that very little is truly irreversible when God chooses to intervene. Iron floats when God says so. The laws of physics yield to the God who made them. The bottom of the river is not the final word on what is lost, and the miracle came quietly. It came through a simple act, a stick thrown into water, rather than through fire or voice or vision. This too is part of the theological message. Divine power does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive with the fanfare that our dramatic imaginations expect. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet impossibility, something rising to the surface that should have stayed at the bottom, and sometimes the only ones who see it are the ones who needed it most. There is grace in that smallness. There is intimacy in a miracle that happens without a crowd. It is as if God, in arranging this particular act of restoration, was saying something not just to the man on the bank, but to every person who would ever read the account. I see you. I see the small thing you have lost. I see the borrowed burden you're carrying, and I am not too large or too important to throw a stick into your river. The theology of small miracles is in some ways more radical than the theology of large ones. A God who parts the Red Sea is impressive. A God who cares about a borrowed axe head is intimate. And intimacy, for human beings who live in the daily texture of small losses and quiet distresses, is perhaps the more sustaining revelation. We can admire a God who moves mountains. We can rest in a God who notices when our tools fall into the water. Section 9. Themes for reflection. What the river teaches. As we move toward the closing of this account, it is worth drawing out the threads of meaning that this ancient story offers to those who sit with it. The first thread is the theology of divine attention, one of the most ancient of human fears, perhaps the oldest of them, older even than the fear of death, is the fear of not being seen, the fear that one's distress does not register, the fear that one's loss does not matter, the fear that in the vast machinery of the universe, Whatever powers govern it are simply too large, too abstract, too removed from the granular reality of individual human experience to notice a single man standing on a single bank holding a single stick. The floating axe head says, "You are seen. Your distress registers. Your borrowed burden matters. The God who manages the movements of galaxies has not lost track of the geography of your grief. This is not a sentimental claim. It is not a comforting myth invented to make people feel better. It is, within the tradition that preserved this story, a reported fact. Elisha asked where the axe head fell. He cared about the specific location. He acted to restore it. And the God whose power Elisha channeled that morning cared about a single piece of iron at the bottom of a river. The second thread is the permanence, or rather, the impermanence of certain kinds of loss. We live in a world that constantly teaches us that some things once lost are gone forever. And this is often true. The laws of entropy are real. Death is real. The passage of time is real. We cannot always recover what we have lost, and wisdom often includes learning to accept that reality. But the floating axe head introduces a counterpoint. Not all sinking is final. Not every loss that feels irreversible actually is. Sometimes the thing you have written off as gone is simply below the surface, waiting for the right moment, the right intervention, the right act of faith that reaches down into the dark water and brings it back. This does not mean that faith is a guarantee of recovery. The scripture is full of losses that were not reversed, griefs that were not resolved, prayers that received answers different from what was asked. The floating axe head is not a promise that everything lost will be found. It is a testimony that some things will be, and that the one who decides which things are possible is not indifferent to our need. The third thread is the simplicity of divine instruments. A stick thrown into water, not a sacred object, not a ritual implement of temple worship, not even, apparently, a spoken prayer that we can record. Just a stick. Just a piece of the same material that the men had been cutting all morning. Just an ordinary thing used as the instrument of an extraordinary moment. This is deeply consistent with the pattern of divine action across Scripture. The rod that parted the Red Sea was a shepherd's walking stick. The stone that killed Goliath was a river pebble. The vessel that held the oil that multiplied was an ordinary clay jar. The means by which God acts are almost never impressive in themselves. Their significance is entirely in what God does through them. This means that faith does not require sacred technology. It does not require access to special materials or privileged instruments. It requires only the willingness to use what is at hand, to throw the stick you have into the water that stands between you and what is lost, and then to watch what happens. The fourth thread is the role of community in ordinary faith. The man on the bank did not struggle alone. He cried out to his teacher. He showed Elisha where the axe head had fallen. He participated in the process of his own recovery by receiving direction and following it. And the restoration took place within the context of a community gathered for a common purpose. Faith is rarely most alive in isolation. It is most alive when it is practiced among people who share a common commitment, when there is an Elisha present to ask where it fell, when there is a fellowship around you that makes the work worth doing in the first place. The fifth and perhaps deepest thread is the sanctity of the ordinary moment. The floating axe head did not happen in a temple. It did not happen during a festival or a sacred ceremony. It happened during a work day. It happened between swings of an axe, in the middle of a construction project, at a moment when everyone's attention was on the very practical task of getting lumber to where it needed to be. The sacred, this story insists, is not confined to sacred spaces or sacred occasions. It can break through at any moment, at any ordinary Tuesday on the banks of any ordinary river, in the middle of any ordinary work that faithful hands have taken up. God is not waiting for you to get to church before he cares about what you lost. He cares about it right where you're standing, at the river's edge, holding a useless handle, wondering how you're going to explain what happened. That is where miracles happen. Not only in temples, not only in crises of national proportion, also in the middle of the work, also at the water's edge, Also in the moment when a borrowed thing sinks, and you cry out, and someone asks, where did it fall? Section 10. Historical context. Iron in the ancient world. To fully appreciate the weight, in every sense of that word, of the lost axe head, we need to step back briefly into the material history of the ancient Near East. Iron metallurgy arrived in Canaan and the surrounding regions during the Iron Age, which historians generally date from approximately 1200 BCE onward. But the spread of iron technology was not uniform or immediate. For centuries after iron first appeared in the region, it remained a relatively rare and expensive material. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, continued to be the dominant material for tools and weapons in many areas, well into the period covered by the Elisha narratives. Iron tools were superior to bronze in many respects. They held an edge better, they were harder, and the raw materials for iron production were more widely available than the tin required for bronze alloys. But the process of smelting iron, the art of reducing iron ore to workable metal through high-temperature reduction, was complex and required skilled practitioners. An iron tool was not the product of a simple process. It was the product of considerable technical knowledge and labour. This means that in the period when Elisha lived, roughly the 9th century BCE, an iron axe head was a genuinely valuable object. Not merely in the way that all tools are valuable because they enable work, but in the way that a well-crafted, expensive piece of equipment is valuable. It was the kind of thing that a man might not be able to easily replace. It was the kind of thing whose loss would have real, material consequences. The scholars who have studied the social economics of the ancient Near East have also noted that the mention of the tool being borrowed is significant not only emotionally but legally. In the ancient Israelite legal tradition, which the sons of the prophets would have known well, the laws governing borrowed objects were detailed and specific. The book of Exodus, chapter 22, outlines the legal obligations of a person who borrows an animal or object from a neighbour. If it is injured or lost, the borrower is liable for its replacement unless it happened in the presence of the owner, in which case the responsibility is shared. The man who lost the axe head knew this legal framework. When he cried out, it was not just an emotional response to a frustrating accident. It was the cry of a man who understood that he stood at a specific legal and moral disadvantage, that the loss was, by the standards of his community, his responsibility to make right. He could not make it right. That was the nature of the crisis. Not just that the tool was gone, but that the obligation it represented was now impossible to fulfill without external help. And this is another reason the story resonates so deeply across the centuries. It speaks to the experience of being unable to fulfill a legitimate obligation, not through negligence or dishonesty or moral failure, but through the simple, awful randomness of an accident that could have happened to anyone. The handle worked loose, the iron flew free, the river took it. None of these things were the man's fault, and yet he stood responsible. The miracle did not just restore a tool, it restored his ability to be the kind of person he wanted to be. A man who honoured his obligations, who kept his word, who returned what he had borrowed. It gave back not just the axe head, but the condition of his integrity. When we read this story through the lens of its historical and material context, the gift of the miracle becomes even more specific and even more tender. God did not just help this man with an inconvenience. God restored his honour. Section 11. The Elisha pattern. A prophet who came close. Throughout the narratives of 2 Kings, Elisha is portrayed with remarkable consistency as a prophet who worked at close range. His predecessor Elijah had been a figure of immense spiritual drama, a man who confronted 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, who outran a royal chariot in the rain, who heard the still small voice of God in a cave after fleeing for his life. Elijah was, in many ways, a larger-than-life figure. His ministry was defined by great public confrontations and great personal crises. Elisha inherited Elijah's mantle, literally as the story goes, catching it as it fell when Elijah was taken up in the whirlwind. But he wore it differently. Elisha's ministry is characterised not by mountaintop drama but by kitchen table care. He operated in the intimate spaces of ordinary life, in widows' homes, in commanders' bathhouses, at meal tables, on building sites. He asked, "Where does the axe head fall?" He asked the widow, "What do you have in your house?" He asked the servant, "What is wrong with the stew?" He asked the Shunammite woman, through Gehazi, his servant, "Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child?" These are not the questions of a prophet positioning himself above the human condition. These are the questions of a man who leaned in, who came close, who considered it entirely within the scope of his calling to sit with a grieving mother or stand on a riverbank with a troubled workman. This quality of proximity, of deliberate closeness to ordinary human need, is part of what makes the Elisha story so compelling, as portraits of what divine care can look like when it is mediated through a human being who has genuinely surrendered themselves to it. Elisha did not need to come to the Jordan. He could have sent the sons of the prophets with his blessing and stayed behind in whatever town he was working from. The building project was their project. They had asked his permission and received it. That could have been the end of his involvement, but one of them had asked him to come, and he came, and because he came, he was there when the axe head fell. He was there to hear the cry. He was there to ask the question. He was there to throw the stick. The presence of the prophet at the work site was not incidental to the miracle. It was the condition that made the miracle available, not because God could not have acted otherwise, but because the man knew where to turn in his distress precisely because the person he trusted was standing right there. This is a profound pastoral truth that has application far beyond the ancient world. Being present when things are ordinary makes you trustworthy when things go wrong. Elisha had earned the right to be cried out to by showing up for the ordinary work. He had not kept himself elevated and separate, available only for crises of sufficient magnitude. He was there, on the muddy riverbank among the sweating workers in the unremarkable morning. And so, when the unremarkable morning became remarkable, there was someone to hear the cry. The sons of the prophets who saw the axe head float that day carried the memory of it with them for the rest of their lives. Not as a miracle that had happened at a distance, in another time and place, that they had heard about second hand, but as something they had witnessed with their own eyes, at close range, on an ordinary morning when they had expected nothing more extraordinary than a pile of timber and a tired sunset. The miracles we witness in proximity to us, the ones that happen within the circle of our ordinary life, have a different quality than the ones we hear about. They are harder to explain away. They are easier to believe in again, later, when we need to. Section 12. Across the centuries, how this story has been received. The story of the floating axe head has been read and interpreted by communities of faith across more than 2.5 millennia. In the Jewish tradition, the Elisha narratives are part of the Deuteronomistic history, the great literary and theological project that encompasses the books from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, tracing the story of Israel from the giving of the law through the catastrophe of the Babylonian exile. Within this tradition, the Elisha stories are often read as testimonies to God's faithfulness in the midst of Israel's unfaithfulness, signs that the God who made covenant with this people had not abandoned them even when their kings had. The floating axe head, in this context, is more than a story about a borrowed tool. It is a testimony that divine care persisted in the personal and domestic, even while the public and national story was moving toward tragedy. The kings of Israel were failing. The national covenant was being broken. And yet, on a riverbank on an ordinary morning, a man cried out about a borrowed axe and God answered. In the early Christian tradition, the Elisha narratives were read through the lens of typology, the interpretive practice of seeing events in the Hebrew scriptures as foreshadowing or prefiguring themes and events in the life of Jesus. The church fathers who engaged this text saw in the floating axe head a symbol of resurrection, the raising of something heavy and dead from the depths, and in Elisha's thrown stick a prefiguring of the cross, through which what was lost would be restored. Whether or not one accepts this typological reading, it reflects something important about why the story has endured. It speaks to universal human experiences in a way that allows it to be received as meaningful across radically different theological and cultural contexts. Medieval Christian interpreters also dwelt on the significance of the borrowed axe head as a symbol of the human soul, borrowed from God, entrusted to us for the span of our lives, and liable to be lost through sin or accident or the wear of ordinary existence. The miracle of the floating axe head became, in this reading, a picture of divine mercy, restoring to human beings what they had lost through their own failure to maintain what was entrusted to them. In more recent centuries, African Christian theological tradition has found particular resonance with the Elisha narratives, and specifically with the stories of ordinary people, widows, servants, common labourers, encountering divine power in the midst of their daily distress. In contexts where poverty and material insecurity are genuine and daily realities, the story of a borrowed tool and its miraculous recovery speaks with a directness and an urgency that can sometimes be lost when the story is read from the comfort of material security. For believers in the global south, for communities that know what it means to borrow, because you cannot afford to own, to worry about the loss of something you cannot replace, to live under the weight of obligations you're not sure you can fulfill. The floating axe head is not a charming ancient curiosity. It is a living word, and in the contemplative Christian traditions, among monks and mystics and those who have dedicated themselves to the life of prayer, the story of the floating axe head has been read as a teaching on the nature of prayer itself. The man did not organise a formal petitioning assembly. He did not prepare a carefully worded theological argument. He simply told his teacher what had happened and why it mattered, and that was enough. The contemplative tradition sees in this a model of what prayer in daily life looks like. Not always formal, not always elaborate, but always honest. Always naming the specific thing that has been lost. Always bringing the particular weight of the particular moment to the one who can be trusted with it. Across all of these traditions, across all of these centuries, the small story on the banks of the Jordan continues to do what small stories do best. It keeps speaking to the people who need it most, in the language they can most understand. Closing reflection. The river remembers. The Jordan River is still there. It is smaller now than it was in ancient times. Significantly smaller, actually, drawn down by the agricultural and industrial demands of a region that has changed almost beyond recognition from the world of the sons of the prophets. The dense thickets along its banks have been thinned. The birds that nested there in ancient mornings have changed. The people who live beside it speak in different tongues, and worship in different ways, and carry the weight of a different set of histories. But the river is still there, and somewhere beneath its surface, in the silt and stone at the bottom, there is the record of everything it has ever received. The debris of 100 civilizations, the sediment of millennia, the accumulated weight of all the things that have ever sunk in its current. And at least once, if we believe the account, the river gave something back. One borrowed thing, one piece of iron, one small act of restoration on an ordinary morning. As you lie in the quiet of this moment, as the sounds of your day recede and the edges of things begin to soften into sleep, consider the weight you're carrying tonight. Maybe it is something borrowed, a trust given to you that you're not sure you can fulfill, a responsibility that felt manageable when you accepted it, and now feels heavier than you expected, an obligation to someone who has been patient with you, but whose patience you worry may be running thin. Maybe it's something lost, a thing, a relationship, a version of yourself that you thought you were building, but that seems to have slipped beneath the surface. Something you grieve quietly, in moments like this one, when the noise has stopped and the truth of what is missing makes itself felt. Maybe it is simply tiredness, the bone-deep weariness of trying to do good work in a world that is harder than it should be, of showing up day after day to the river's edge with your tools and your hope and your borrowed obligations, doing the best you can. The sons of the prophets were tired men too. They were ordinary people doing ordinary work, building something that mattered in a world that was not always kind to what mattered. They had walked a long way to get to the river. They had picked up their axes and begun the work that needed doing, even though they were not sure how it would turn out. And when one of them lost something he could not afford to lose, he cried out. Not in a grand theological declaration, not in a formal petition, just a cry. Just the truth, spoken plainly to someone who could be trusted with it. And the river gave it back. Whatever sinks in your life tonight, whatever weight has gone below the surface and seems lost to the dark water, belongs to a God who knows where it fell. Who asks that question? Who cares about the specific geography of your grief, the precise location of your loss? And who, in the right moment, in the quiet way that is always more surprising than the dramatic way, may reach down with the simplest of instruments and bring it back to where you can reach it? You do not have to do anything tonight except rest. The river is not your responsibility to drain or to search. You're not required to solve what you have lost in order to be held by the one who knows it is missing. Elisha asked, "Where did it fall?" He already knew the answer before the question finished crossing the air. He was asking so that the man could say it out loud, so that the specific shape of the loss could be named and witnessed and brought into the light where it could be addressed. Where did it fall? What have you lost that was borrowed? What sank before you could catch it? Name it quietly, in the space inside you where no one else goes. Name it to the one who is already listening, and then rest. The stick has been thrown into the water. The iron will find the surface. Sleep now. The river knows its business, and you are known. If this story moved something in you, if you felt the weight of a borrowed thing and the quiet hope of restoration, share that with someone tomorrow. Leave a review on Spotify. Drop a hype point in the comments. Tell us your city and your time zone. It means more than you know to understand how far the sound of this reaches. We will be here tomorrow night with another story from the edge of history and the edge of sleep. Rest well, rest deep. The night is long and you are held. In the shadow of Damascus, where the ancient stones still whisper of empires long turned to dust, there lived a man who seemed invincible. His name was Naaman, commander of the Aramean army, a warrior whose very presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of war. Kings sought his counsel, soldiers followed him without question. His reputation stretched across the known world like the wings of an eagle. But beneath the polished armour, beneath the ceremonial robes that marked his station, his skin told a different story. It was marked, diseased, corrupted by leprosy, a condition that no amount of gold could cure, no military strategy could defeat, no royal decree could banish. Here was a man who could conquer nations but could not conquer his own flesh. What happens when the strongest man in a kingdom faces a weakness no sword can defeat? What happens when power meets powerlessness, when pride confronts humility, when a foreign warrior discovers that healing comes not from his gods, but from the god of his enemies? Chapter 1. The captive servant girl. The raids into Israel had become routine. Aramean soldiers would sweep down from the north, taking livestock supplies, and occasionally people. Among those taken was a young girl, no more than a child, torn from everything she knew and brought into a foreign household. She had no name recorded in scripture, no monument erected in her honour, no songs sung about her courage. History would remember her only as the servant girl. She became part of Naaman's household, attending to his wife, performing the daily tasks that kept a commander's home running smoothly. But this girl carried something more valuable than any treasure the Aramean raiders had seized. She carried faith, despite her captivity, despite being ripped from her homeland and family, despite serving in the house of the very man whose armies had destroyed her world. She harboured no bitterness. Instead, when she learned of her master's affliction, she spoke words that would change the course of history. "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria," she told Naaman's wife one day, her voice carrying the certainty of one who has witnessed miracles. He would cure him of his leprosy. Think about the extraordinary nature of this moment. A captive showing compassion to her captor, a victim offering hope to her oppressor, a child from Israel proclaiming that the God of her defeated people could do what all the gods and physicians of mighty Aram could not. Her words travelled from servant quarters to the mistress's chamber, from wife to husband, from private suffering to public action. This unnamed girl, this overlooked child, became the first link in a chain of events that would demonstrate God's power beyond the borders of Israel. She could have remained silent. She could have taken satisfaction in her master's suffering. She could have seen his disease as divine justice. Instead, she became an instrument of grace, proving that faith often speaks loudest through the voices society ignores. Chapter 2. A King's Letter. When Naaman heard his wife relay the servant girl's words, he faced a choice. Would he, a commander of armies, humble himself to seek help from the prophet of a conquered people? Pride warred with desperation. Disease has a way of making decisions clearer. He brought the matter to his king, the ruler of Aram, and the king responded with the full weight of royal authority. The king of Aram prepared a letter, sealed it with his signet ring, and loaded Naaman's entourage with gifts befitting a diplomatic mission of the highest importance. The inventory was staggering. 10 talents of silver, approximately 750 pounds of precious metal, 6,000 shekels of gold, roughly 150 pounds of the most valuable commodity in the ancient world, 10 sets of fine garments, the kind worn only by nobility, woven with threads of purple and scarlet, symbols of wealth and power. The letter itself was direct, almost demanding. "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." The delegation set out, a spectacle of military might and diplomatic prestige. Chariots rolled southward toward Israel, horses' hooves thundering against ancient roads, banners snapping in the wind. Naaman rode at the head of this procession, a warrior seeking not conquest but cure, carrying not weapons of war but gifts of desperation. When they arrived in Samaria, the letter was delivered to Joram, king of Israel. The king broke the seal, unrolled the parchment, read the words, and his face went pale. His hands began to tremble. Without warning, he tore his robes, the traditional sign of extreme distress, and cried out to his advisers. "Am I God?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the palace chambers. "Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this man send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." From Joram's perspective, this was a political trap. Aram was asking the impossible, demanding that he perform a miracle, knowing he would fail, providing the perfect pretext for war. The gifts were not offerings, but provocations. The letter was not a request, but an accusation waiting to happen. Fear gripped the palace. Councillors whispered of troop movements and military preparations. The shadow of war seemed to fall across Israel once again. But the king of Israel, in his panic, had forgotten something crucial. There was indeed a prophet in the land, and God was not limited by royal anxiety or political calculation. Chapter 3. Elisha intervenes. News of the king's distress spread quickly through Samaria. In those days, prophets often knew things before official messengers arrived, their connection to the divine providing intelligence no spy network could match. Elisha the prophet, successor to Elijah, student of miracles, heard that the king had torn his robes in fear and despair. He sent a message to the palace, brief and confident. "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Notice the phrasing. Not, "he might be healed," or "I will try to help him." The message contained certainty, promise, and purpose. Naaman would know, not just experience healing, but understand its source. This was not merely about curing disease. This was about revelation, about a foreign commander encountering the one true God. The king, relieved to shift this impossible burden, sent word to Naaman. The commander and his entourage redirected their impressive procession toward the prophet's house. Can you imagine that scene? The dust clouds visible from miles away as chariots approached, the sound of horses and soldiers, the glint of armour in the sun. Naaman, dressed in his finest ceremonial attire, surrounded by evidence of his wealth and power, approaching the modest dwelling of a prophet. He expected ceremony equal to his station. He anticipated a grand welcome, dramatic rituals, impressive displays of prophetic power. He was, after all, the commander of Aram's armies, carrying a king's letter and a fortune in gifts. Surely the prophet would emerge, perhaps call upon his God with raised hands and fervent prayers, perform elaborate cleansing ceremonies, make a great show of divine intervention. Naaman's expectations were about to collide with God's methods. Chapter 4. The Unexpected Instruction. Elisha did not come out. The door remained closed. The prophet, aware of the impressive entourage waiting outside his home, sent a messenger instead, not even appearing personally to address this visiting dignitary. The messenger walked out, faced the commander of Aram's armies, and delivered instructions that would become one of the most famous prescriptions in biblical history. "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed." That was it. No ritual, no ceremony, no divine fireworks, no laying on of hands, no dramatic prayers or prophetic pronouncements. Just simple instructions. Go to the river, wash 7 times, be healed. The messenger delivered this message and returned inside, leaving Naaman standing there, surrounded by his soldiers, his gifts, his expectations and his growing fury. The Jordan River. The Yam, of all places, the Jordan River. Naaman knew that river. He had crossed it during military campaigns. It was not impressive. It was muddy, narrow in places, nothing compared to the great rivers of his homeland. The absurdity of the instruction struck him like a slap across the face. This was not what he had travelled hundreds of miles to hear. This was not worthy of the gifts he brought. This was not the treatment a commander deserved. Where was the respect? Where was the acknowledgement of his status? Where was the prophet himself? The instruction felt like an insult, a dismissal, a mockery of his desperate journey. Chapter 5. Pride confronted. Naaman turned away in a rage. His face flushed, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. All the frustration, fear and wounded pride of a powerful man facing powerlessness came pouring out. I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy, he said, his voice sharp with indignation. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? His reasoning made worldly sense. The rivers of Damascus were indeed clearer, cleaner, more impressive. If washing in a river was the cure, why not wash in superior rivers at home? Why travel all this way to dip in a muddy stream? The instruction seemed arbitrary, unnecessary beneath him. But hidden in his anger was the real issue. This was not about the river at all. This was about control. Naaman wanted to dictate the terms of his healing. He wanted a cure that matched his expectations, that honoured his position, that made sense to his military mind. He wanted to remain in control even of his miracle. Pride, that ancient enemy of the soul, had wrapped itself around his heart so tightly that he was willing to walk away from healing rather than submit to simple obedience. He was prepared to remain diseased rather than humble himself before instructions that offended his dignity. The same pride that had driven him to greatness on the battlefield was now driving him away from wholeness. He turned his chariots around. The great procession began to withdraw, carrying its commander back toward Aram, back toward continued suffering, back toward slow death by disease. He would rather die proud than live humbled. But God was not finished with Naaman yet. Chapter 6. The Servant's Wisdom. As the entourage moved away from Elisha's house, Naaman's servants gathered their courage. These men had served him long enough to know his temper, to understand his pride, to recognize that this moment required careful words. They approached him, speaking with the delicate diplomacy of those who must tell powerful people truths they do not want to hear. "My father," one of them began, using a term of respect and affection that softened the correction to come. "If the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then, when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" The logic was irrefutable. If Elisha had demanded some heroic quest, some impossible task, some test of courage or endurance, Naaman would have accepted without hesitation. If the prophet had required him to climb a mountain, to fast for 40 days, to bring rare offerings from distant lands, the commander would have done it gladly. Such tasks would have matched his sense of what a miracle should cost, what healing should require. But the prophet had asked for something simple, too simple, so simple it seemed meaningless. And perhaps that was precisely the point. The servant's question exposed the contradiction in their master's thinking. He was willing to do anything except the one thing required: humble, simple obedience. Their words created a pause in Naaman's rage. The rationality of their argument cut through his indignation. They were not commanding him. They were not mocking him. They were gently, carefully, respectfully showing him that his pride was costing him everything. Naaman looked at these men, his servants, but also his companions, his trusted advisors. They had followed him into battle. They had watched him lead armies to victory. They had witnessed his strength and his suffering. And now they were offering him wisdom more valuable than all the military strategies he had ever devised. He made a choice. He would obey. Chapter 7. The 7 Washings. The journey to the Jordan River was different now. The anger had drained away, replaced by something quieter. Determination, perhaps, or resignation, or the first stirrings of genuine faith. When they reached the river's edge, Naaman dismounted from his chariot. He removed his commander's robes, the symbols of his rank and power, and stood at the water's edge as simply a man, diseased, desperate, willing. He waded into the Jordan. The water was indeed muddy, unimpressive, ordinary. He submerged himself once, came up, looked at his skin. Nothing had changed. The leprous patches remained, mocking his hope. He went under a second time, rose again, still diseased. The water ran off his afflicted flesh, leaving it as marked as before. Third time, fourth, fifth. With each immersion, he had to choose again to believe, to continue, to trust that something was happening, even when nothing appeared to be changing. This was the test within the test, not just to obey once, but to persist in obedience when results seemed absent. Imagine the thoughts running through his mind. Was this a cruel joke? Had the prophet sent him on a fool's errand? Would his servants, watching from the shore, lose faith in him? Would he return to Aram not only diseased but humiliated? 6th immersion. The water closed over his head again. He stood, water streaming from his hair and beard. The leprosy remained. One more. 7 was a number of completion in Hebrew understanding, the number of divine perfection, the number of days in creation. 7 times he must wash. 7 times he must choose humility over pride, obedience over understanding, faith over sight. He went under the 7th time. When he rose from the Jordan River on that 7th washing, everything changed. His skin was not simply improved or partially healed. Scripture says his flesh was restored like that of a young boy. The leprosy was gone completely, replaced by healthy, clean, unblemished skin. Years of disease, of social isolation, of watching his body slowly deteriorate despite all his power and wealth, erased in a moment of simple obedience. Naaman stood in the Jordan River, looking at his arms, his hands, touching his face, examining what had happened to him. This was not gradual improvement. This was transformation. This was miracle. This was the power of the God of Israel made manifest in his flesh. He had come to Israel as a proud commander. He emerged from the Jordan as a changed man. Chapter 8. Faith awakens. Dripping with river water, restored in body, awakening in spirit, Naaman returned to Elisha's house. But this time he came not with demands or expectations. He came with wonder, with gratitude, with the beginnings of genuine faith. His entire entourage accompanied him, soldiers who had witnessed the miracle, servants who had counselled him to obedience, attendants who had travelled this whole impossible journey. This time Elisha came. The prophet stood before the commander, and Naaman spoke words that would echo through centuries of biblical teaching. "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel," he declared, his voice carrying the conviction of one who has experienced the undeniable. "So please accept a gift from your servant." Everything he had brought, the silver, the gold, the fine garments, he urged upon the prophet. This was more than gratitude. This was a man trying to make sense of an experience that had shattered his understanding of reality. In his world, healers were paid. Services rendered required payment. Power exchanged hands through transactions. He needed to give something back, to balance the scales, to make this miracle fit into categories he understood. But Elisha refused. "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing," the prophet said firmly. Even when Naaman urged him repeatedly, pressed the gifts upon him, insisted that he must accept something, Elisha remained adamant. The refusal itself was a teaching moment, another lesson in a day full of revelations. Healing from God cannot be purchased. Divine power is not for sale. Miracles are not transactions. This was grace, freely given, unearned and unpayable. The God who healed Naaman wanted no payment except what the commander had already offered without realizing it: humility, obedience, and awakening faith. But Naaman, struggling to grasp this new theology, made one more request. If he could not pay for the miracle, perhaps he could at least take something back with him that would connect him to this God who had healed him. "If you will not accept payment," he said, "then please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." The request reveals so much about his transformation and his continued journey of understanding. He still thought in terms of geography and physical connection, that to worship the God of Israel, he needed soil from Israel. His theology was incomplete, his understanding still developing. But the sincerity was undeniable. He was declaring exclusive devotion to the God who had healed him, planning to bring Israel's God into his homeland, preparing to worship in Aram with earth from Israel under his feet. He made one more confession, revealing the complexity of his situation. "But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." He was describing his duty as commander, accompanying his king into the temple of Aram's gods, supporting the king physically as he bowed, required by his position to participate in rituals he could no longer believe in. He was asking for grace in the midst of complicated realities, seeking to balance newfound faith with political obligations. Elisha's response was gentle. Go in peace. No condemnation, no lecture, no demands for immediate perfect theological understanding or complete separation from his culture, just blessing and release. The prophet recognized that faith is a journey, that transformation happens in stages, that God is patient with those taking their first steps toward him. Naaman departed, no longer just healed but converted, no longer just cleansed but changed, carrying with him earth from Israel and a story he would tell for the rest of his life. Chapter 9. A Converted Heart. As Naaman's chariots rolled away from Elisha's dwelling, they carried more than a healed commander. They carried a testimony that would spread through Aram and beyond. The servants who had witnessed everything would tell the story. The soldiers who had stood guard during the 7 washings would describe what they saw. The commander himself would become a living witness to the power of Israel's God. Consider what Naaman was bringing back to Damascus. 2 mule loads of Israeli soil, yes, but also a completely changed worldview. He had come seeking physical healing and received spiritual transformation. He had arrived as a worshipper of Aramean gods and was returning as a devotee of the God of Israel. He had travelled south as a proud military leader and was journeying home as a humble servant of the divine. His request for soil reveals the early, incomplete nature of his understanding, but also the sincerity of his conversion. In the ancient world, gods were often thought to be territorial, connected to specific lands and peoples. Naaman believed that to worship the God of Israel properly, he needed to stand on Israel's earth, to create a small piece of Israel in the heart of Aram. While his theology would need refinement, God is not limited by geography. His heart was moving in the right direction. The transformation went beyond religious belief. His entire approach to power, pride, and position had been revolutionized. The man who had been insulted by simple instructions had learned the value of humble obedience. The commander who had expected grand ceremonies had discovered that God often works through ordinary means. The proud warrior had found that true strength sometimes looks like submission. His healing would become famous in both Israel and Aram. Every time someone saw his clean skin, they would ask what had happened. Every time he told the story, he would have to speak of his pride, his anger, his servant's wisdom, and the muddy Jordan River where everything changed. His very body became a permanent testimony to the God who heals beyond borders, who shows mercy to foreigners, who values humility over status. But the story was not quite finished. There was one more character who needed to make his choice. One more lesson about the corruption that can flourish even in the presence of miracles. Chapter 10. Gehazi's Greed. Gehazi had watched everything. As Elisha's servant, he had been present for the entire encounter with Naaman. He had seen the proud commander arrive with his impressive entourage. He had heard his master give the simple instructions that enraged the foreign warrior. He had learned of the healing at the Jordan. He had stood beside Elisha when Naaman returned, transformed and grateful, pressing gifts upon the prophet. And he had watched his master refuse everything. Now, as Naaman's chariots disappeared down the road, Gehazi stood beside Elisha, and something dark stirred in his heart. He had served the prophet faithfully. He had witnessed miracles. He had been entrusted with prophetic ministry. But in this moment, all he could think about was what had just been refused. My master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, he muttered to himself, rationalizing what he was about to do. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. Notice the twisted logic. He invoked God's name to justify greed. He convinced himself that Elisha had been wrong to refuse payment, that accepting gifts would actually be more appropriate. He saw an opportunity for personal gain and dressed it up in righteous language. This is how corruption often begins, not with obvious evil, but with seemingly reasonable justifications for doing what we want to do anyway. Gehazi ran after Naaman's chariots. When the commander saw someone pursuing him, he stopped and dismounted to meet this messenger, assuming Elisha had sent him with some additional instruction or request. "Is everything all right?" Naaman asked, concern in his voice. "Everything is all right," Gehazi lied smoothly. "My master sent me to say, 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing." The lie was specific, detailed, calculated to seem believable. 2 young prophets, unexpected visitors, a reasonable request for modest gifts to support them. Gehazi had crafted his deception carefully, asking for less than Naaman had originally offered, making it seem like a small, charitable need rather than personal greed. Naaman, grateful beyond measure for his healing, eager to give something back, responded with generous enthusiasm. "By all means, take 2 talents, he said, doubling what Gehazi had requested. He had the silver wrapped in 2 bags and gave them along with 2 sets of clothing to 2 of his servants, who carried them back toward Elisha's house with Gehazi. When they got near the house, Gehazi took the bags from the servants and sent them away. He hid the silver and clothing inside the house, concealing the evidence of his deception. Then he went in and stood before his master as if nothing had happened, as if he had been there all along. Chapter 11. Judgment. Falls. Elisha looked at his servant, and Gehazi felt the weight of that gaze. Prophets see what others cannot. They know what has happened in their absence. They perceive the secrets of hearts. Gehazi had forgotten in his greed exactly whom he was dealing with. "Where have you been, Gehazi?" Elisha asked, giving his servant one chance to tell the truth, one opportunity to confess and repent. "Your servant didn't go anywhere," Gehazi replied, compounding his sin with another lie, choosing to persist in deception even when confronted by a man who spoke with God's authority. Then Elisha spoke words that must have frozen Gehazi's blood. "Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money or to accept clothes, or olive groves and vineyards, or flocks and herds, or male and female slaves?" The prophet had seen everything, every step of Gehazi's pursuit, every word of his lie, every moment of his deception. More than that, Elisha understood what Gehazi's actions represented. Not just theft, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what prophetic ministry was about. Gehazi had witnessed the healing of Naaman, had seen divine power manifest, had stood in the presence of miracle, and all he could think about was how to profit from it. He had treated God's gift as a business opportunity. He had seen the healing of the diseased commander as a chance for personal enrichment. He had exploited Naaman's gratitude and violated his master's explicit refusal. He had lied to both the foreign commander and the prophet, and he had done it all in the name of the Lord, using religious language to justify spiritual corruption. The judgment was swift and severe. Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever. In the ultimate irony, the disease that had been removed from the Aramean commander now fell upon the Israelite servant. The healing that Gehazi had tried to exploit became the source of his own affliction. He left Elisha's presence with his skin leprous. It had become as white as snow. The disease he had witnessed being cured now marked his own flesh, a permanent reminder of the cost of greed, the danger of exploiting grace, the corruption that can infect even those who serve in ministry. Gehazi's tragedy illustrates a truth that echoes through all of Scripture. Proximity to divine power does not guarantee spiritual health. Being close to miracles does not prevent moral failure. Serving a prophet does not automatically make one prophetic. The same God who heals with grace also judges with righteousness. Themes and spiritual breakdown, healing beyond borders. The healing of Naaman shatters any notion that God's power is limited by national identity or ethnic boundaries. Here was a Syrian commander, a man from a nation that had raided Israel, taken captives and fought against God's chosen people. By every measure of ancient religious thinking, he should have been outside the reach of Israel's God. Yet God not only healed him, but pursued him, orchestrated his journey, and revealed divine power specifically for this foreigner. This story challenges exclusive thinking about who deserves God's attention. The unnamed captive servant girl, the unlikely prophetic instructions, the healing of someone who had no claim on Israel's covenant. All of it points toward a God whose mercy extends beyond tribal boundaries, whose grace reaches those we might consider outsiders, whose power works for the benefit of those who have been our enemies. Centuries later, Jesus would reference this story when teaching in his hometown synagogue. When the people of Nazareth rejected him, he reminded them that there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. It was not a popular teaching then, and it remains challenging now. God's grace often flows to unexpected recipients, demonstrating divine love that transcends our categories of deserving and undeserving. Pride versus obedience. Naaman's initial response to Elisha's instructions reveals the fundamental conflict between human pride and divine requirement. He wanted a healing that matched his expectations, grand, impressive, worthy of his status. Instead, he received instructions that seemed beneath him, too simple to be miraculous, too ordinary to be divine. His journey from rage to obedience traces a path that many must walk in their relationship with God. We come with expectations about how God should work, what miracles should look like, how divine power should manifest. We expect ceremonies that honour our importance, processes that make sense to our understanding, interventions that fit our categories of impressive and meaningful. When God instead offers simple instructions, ordinary means, humble requirements, we face a choice. Will we insist on our expectations or submit to divine wisdom? The 7 washings in the Jordan required Naaman to persist in obedience even when results were not immediately visible. After the first washing, nothing changed. After the second, third, fourth, fifth, 6th, still diseased. Each immersion required renewed choice to trust, continued willingness to look foolish, ongoing commitment to obey even when sight provided no confirmation. This is the nature of faith, not believing because we see, but obeying until we see, trusting that God's instructions carry purpose even when that purpose is not yet evident. Faith through servitude. The unnamed captive servant girl stands as one of the most remarkable figures in the entire narrative. She had every reason to hate Naaman, to rejoice in his suffering, to see his disease as just punishment. Instead, she became the conduit of grace, speaking words that would lead to his healing. Her position was the lowest in the household, a foreign captive, a child, a servant. Yet her faith moved mountains, her testimony triggered a journey, her simple words set in motion events that would demonstrate God's power to nations. This pattern repeats throughout Scripture, God working through the overlooked, speaking through unexpected voices, using the powerless to confound the powerful. The servant girl's faith was not complicated or theological. She simply knew that the prophet in her homeland could heal, and she cared enough about her master's suffering to tell him so. Her compassion toward her captor, her faith despite her circumstances, her willingness to speak up despite her low status, all of it reveals the nature of genuine faith, which operates independently of comfort, position, or personal benefit. Similarly, Naaman's servants provided the wisdom that saved him from his pride. When he was about to walk away from healing because the instructions offended his dignity, they gently reasoned with him, showed him the illogic of his position, and counselled him toward obedience. They risked their master's anger to tell him truth he needed to hear. Both the captive girl and the servants demonstrate that God often places crucial wisdom in the mouths of those society considers least important. Integrity in ministry, Gehazi's judgment serves as a sobering counterpoint to Naaman's healing. While the Syrian commander experienced transformation through humility and obedience, the Israelite servant experienced judgment through greed and deception. The contrast is stark and intentional. The outsider who humbled himself was healed. The insider who exploited grace was afflicted. Gehazi's sin was not simply theft or lying, though both were present. His fundamental error was treating divine power as a commodity, seeing the healing of Naaman as a business opportunity, exploiting someone's gratitude for personal gain. He violated the principle Elisha had established by refusing payment, that God's grace cannot be bought or sold, that miracles are not transactions, that ministry must not become mercenary. This warning echoes through the centuries to anyone involved in spiritual leadership or ministry. The temptation to monetize grace, to exploit people's desperation, to treat divine power as a source of personal enrichment, these dangers are perennial. Gehazi's judgment reminds us that God takes seriously the integrity of those who represent him, that serving in ministry does not exempt us from moral requirements, that proximity to miracles does not prevent corruption. The fact that his descendants would carry the leprosy forever suggests that the consequences of spiritual corruption can extend beyond the individual. When those who minister in God's name violate that trust, they damage not only themselves but also those who follow them, creating cynicism and distrust that can last for generations. Epilogue. The warrior made whole. Naaman returned to Damascus transformed. Every journey back is different from the journey out, but his return carried weight that few journeys bear. He left Syria as a diseased commander seeking cure, and returned as a healed believer carrying testimony. He departed as a worshipper of Aramean gods, and came home as a devotee of Israel's God. He went south proud and angry, and travelled back humbled and grateful. Imagine his arrival in Damascus. The watchmen on the walls would have seen the dust of his chariots approaching. The people would have gathered to see if the journey had been successful. His wife would have waited anxiously for news. The king would have summoned him to hear the report, and when they saw his skin, clean, healthy, restored like a child's, the questions would have flowed like water. What happened? Who healed you? How was it done? And Naaman would have told them everything, not just about the healing, but about the journey that led to it, about the captive servant girl whose faith sparked hope, about the prophet who wouldn't come out to meet him, about the insulting instructions and his wounded pride, about servants who spoke wisdom, about 7 washings in a muddy river, about the change that came not when he expected it, but when he obeyed it, about the God who heals beyond borders, who values humility over status, who works through ordinary means to accomplish extraordinary transformation. His testimony would have spread through Damascus and beyond, challenging the religious assumptions of his culture, planting questions about the nature of divine power, demonstrating that the God of Israel was not limited to Israel. He would have worshipped on his imported soil, making sacrifices not to Rimmon or the other gods of Aram, but to the God who had made him whole. His very presence became a permanent witness to grace that crosses boundaries, power that serves love, and a God who pursues the lost even in foreign lands. But perhaps the most profound transformation was internal. Naaman had learned that healing requires more than seeking cure. It requires humble submission to divine instruction, even when that instruction seems beneath us, offensive to our dignity, or contrary to our expectations. He discovered that miracles often come not through grand displays of power, but through simple obedience to quiet instructions. He found that the God who could heal his flesh was also committed to transforming his heart, teaching him lessons about pride, humility, obedience, and faith that would shape the rest of his life. Somewhere in Syria, for the rest of his days, when people looked at the clean skin of the commander of the armies, they saw a walking testimony to the power of Israel's God. His healing became a permanent sermon, his restoration a living witness, his transformation proof that the divine reaches beyond borders, breaks through pride, and offers wholeness to those willing to humble themselves and obey. The story ends with Naaman healed and Gehazi diseased, a juxtaposition that captures the paradox of grace and judgment, the reality that God's power can both restore and afflict, the truth that proximity to miracles guarantees nothing, and that genuine faith often flourishes in unexpected places, while corruption can grow even in sacred spaces, and always, at the centre of it all, the muddy Jordan River where a proud warrior became humble enough to be healed, where 7 simple washings accomplished what no physician could achieve, where obedience unlocked miracle, where a foreign commander met the one true God and was forever changed. Naaman and the River of Humility, a Christian Bible story of healing through obedience. Intro. When pride stands between us and healing. You stand at the edge of a river. The water is brown, murky, nothing special. Behind you are the greatest physicians of your nation, the finest robes money can buy, and a lifetime of victories that have earned you honour in the eyes of kings. But none of it can heal what lives beneath your skin. Sometimes, the greatest barrier to healing is not the illness itself, but the pride that tells us we deserve something grander, something more worthy of our status. This is a story about a powerful man who travelled far seeking a miracle, only to discover that God's power often works through the simplest acts of obedience. It unfolds in the ancient Near East, in a time when nations clashed and prophets spoke with authority that made kings tremble. The kingdoms of Israel and Aram existed in a constant state of tension, sometimes at war, sometimes at uneasy peace, always watching each other across borders that shifted with the outcomes of battles. In this world, reputation meant everything. A man's name could open doors or close them forever. And at the centre of our story stands a question we all must answer, in our own time and in our own way. Will we humble ourselves enough to receive what we cannot earn? Will we trust God's methods even when they contradict our expectations? Will we choose obedience over pride when the two stand in opposition? This is not just an ancient story. It is a mirror held up to every heart that has ever struggled with the tension between what we think we deserve and what God offers freely. It is about healing that goes deeper than skin, transformation that touches the soul, and the unexpected places where grace appears when we are finally humble enough to receive it. Chapter 1. A commander with authority. His name was Naaman, and in the kingdom of Aram that name carried weight. It opened doors, it commanded respect. It struck fear into the hearts of enemies and inspired confidence in the hearts of allies. He was commander of the army, a position earned not through birthright or political manoeuvring, but through brilliance on the battlefield and loyalty to his king. When Naaman spoke, soldiers listened. When he strategized, enemies fell. When he led his troops into battle, victory followed more often than not. The king of Aram himself honoured this man, recognizing that through Naaman's leadership, the Lord had given victory to the nation. This is a remarkable acknowledgement, appearing in the biblical text itself. Even a pagan king recognized that Naaman's success came from a power beyond mere military skill. There was something about this commander that set him apart, something that made him more than just another soldier who had risen through the ranks. He was valiant, brave in a way that inspired others to be brave. He was strategic, able to see the battlefield not just as it was, but as it would be 3 moves ahead. He was respected, earning the kind of loyalty from his men that cannot be commanded but must be given freely. But victory has a way of hiding what happens behind closed doors. Beneath the armour and the accolades, Naaman carried a secret that no sword could defend against and no strategy could defeat. He had leprosy. The disease was slowly claiming his skin, marking him with something that all his power and prestige could not erase. In the ancient world, leprosy was more than a medical condition. It was a social death sentence, a mark of impurity that could separate a person from everything they knew and everyone they loved. For a man like Naaman, the disease must have been particularly cruel. His entire identity was built on strength, on capability, on the ability to control outcomes through skill and determination. But here was something beyond his control, something that reduced him from commander to patient, from powerful to powerless. In public, he was the mighty commander, reviewing troops and planning campaigns and receiving the honours due to a national hero. In private, he was a man watching his own body betray him, knowing that even the greatest warrior cannot fight what lives within, cannot win a battle against an enemy that is part of himself. The leprosy would have started small, perhaps, a patch of discoloured skin, a spot that did not heal, a sensation of numbness where there should have been feeling. But Naaman would have known what it meant. He would have recognised the signs, would have understood that this was the beginning of something that would only progress, only worsen, only spread until it consumed everything he had built. And there was nothing he could do about it. No battle strategy could defeat it. No amount of honour or wealth or military genius could cure it. For the first time in his life, Naaman faced an enemy he could not overcome through his own strength. Chapter 2. The Captive Servant Girl. In Naaman's household served a young girl from Israel, taken captive during one of Aram's raids into enemy territory. We do not know her name. The biblical text does not record it, and perhaps that is fitting. She represents all the unnamed people throughout history, whose faith has changed the world in ways they could never have imagined, whose simple words have altered the course of events, whose obedience to God has brought healing to places of pain. She had lost everything. Her home, whatever dwelling she had known in Israel, was now beyond her reach. Her family, if they had survived the raid, was separated from her by distance and circumstance. Her freedom, the most precious possession of any human being, had been stripped away. She belonged now to Naaman's household, serving his wife, performing the daily tasks expected of a servant in a wealthy home. She ground grain and drew water and prepared food, and attended to her mistress with no choice in the matter, no control over her own life, no power to change her circumstances. Yet somewhere in her captivity, she had not lost her faith. This is the remarkable thing. She had every reason to be bitter, to curse the God of Israel for allowing her to be taken, to turn away from faith in a deity who seemed to have abandoned her to slavery in a foreign land. But she had not. Her faith remained intact, a quiet flame that continued to burn even in the darkness of her captivity. She knew about the prophets in Israel. She remembered the stories of God's power. She held on to the belief that the God she served was capable of miracles, even here, even now, even in the house of her captors. She served Naaman's wife, and in that service she watched. She saw the burden her master carried. She saw the worry in his wife's eyes, the concern that no amount of wealth or status could ease. She saw the private pain behind the public power, and one day she spoke. Her voice was small but certain, the words of someone who possessed no authority except the authority of truth. She told her mistress about a prophet in Samaria, a man of God named Elisha who could heal the commander. Think about that moment. Consider what it required of this young girl. She had every reason to remain silent, to let her captor suffer, to find satisfaction in the downfall of the man whose army had torn her from her home. Some might have seen Naaman's leprosy as divine justice, as punishment for the raids he had led, as fitting retribution for the suffering he had caused. But this girl did not think that way. When she saw suffering, even the suffering of her captor, she offered hope. When she had the opportunity to withhold information that could help, she chose instead to speak truth. When silence would have been easier and perhaps emotionally satisfying, she chose compassion. This is radical faith. This is the kind of faith that does not wait for perfect circumstances or ideal situations before it acts. This is the faith that sees a need and responds, that holds no grudges, that believes God's healing power is meant for everyone, even enemies, even those who have caused harm. The servant girl could not have known what would happen next. She could not have foreseen that her words would lead to international diplomacy, to a confrontation between prophet and commander, to a healing that would echo through the centuries. She simply spoke truth when truth was needed, and trusted God to do the rest. Sometimes the voice of God comes from the most unexpected places. It comes from those we overlook, from those who have nothing to gain except the knowledge that they spoke truth when silence would have been easier. It comes from captives and children and outcasts and servants, from all the people the world dismisses as insignificant. This young girl had no power, no status, no voice in the larger world. But she had faith, and she had compassion, and she had the courage to speak, and that was enough to set in motion a miracle. Chapter 3. The Journey for Healing. Naaman took the servant girl's words to his king, and the king of Aram did what kings do when their greatest commander is in need. He did not dismiss the suggestion as the superstitious rambling of a captive child. He did not ignore the possibility that healing might be found in enemy territory. Instead, he treated it as a serious diplomatic matter, worthy of official correspondence and royal support. This tells us something about how much Naaman was valued, how important he was to the security and success of the nation. A king does not go to such lengths for just any soldier. The king of Aram wrote a letter to the king of Israel, carefully worded in the formal language of international diplomacy. The letter would have been carried by official messengers, sealed with the royal seal, presented with all the ceremony appropriate to communication between monarchs. And he sent Naaman on what was essentially a diplomatic mission of healing, a journey that blurred the lines between politics and prayer, between military necessity and personal need. Naaman travelled with an entourage befitting his status. This was not a secret trip or a humble pilgrimage. This was a commander travelling in full view of the world, with the backing of his king and the resources of a nation at his disposal. He brought 750 pounds of silver, a staggering amount of wealth that would have required multiple pack animals to transport. He brought 150 pounds of gold, precious metal that represented not just money, but power, prestige, the ability to open any door and purchase any service. He brought 10 sets of clothing, fine garments that were themselves markers of status and wealth in the ancient world. He carried the letter from his king like a golden ticket, expecting doors to open, expecting honour, expecting a healing worthy of a commander. In his mind, the journey probably seemed straightforward. He would arrive in Israel with his impressive entourage. He would present the letter from his king to the king of Israel. The king would arrange for the healing, perhaps through court physicians or religious rituals. Naaman would be cured, would return home in triumph, would resume his life with this obstacle removed. It all made perfect sense according to the logic of power and privilege that governed his world. But when the king of Israel read the letter requesting that he cure Naaman of leprosy, everything went wrong. The king's response was not gratitude or careful diplomacy, but sheer panic. He tore his robes in distress, a dramatic gesture that signalled either mourning or extreme agitation. "Am I God," he cried to anyone who would listen, "that I can kill and bring back to life? This king sends a man to me to cure him of leprosy. See how he is seeking a quarrel with me." The king of Israel saw it as a trap, a political setup designed to create conflict. In his mind, the king of Aram was setting impossible conditions, asking for something no human could provide so that when it was not provided, war could be justified. It was a paranoid interpretation, perhaps, but not entirely unreasonable given the history between these two nations. The king of Israel understood his own limitations. He knew he could not heal leprosy. He had no prophets on retainer, no miracle workers at his beck and call. He was just a man, a political leader trying to navigate the dangerous waters of international relations, and now he was being asked to do the impossible. The king did not see what was really happening, that God was orchestrating something far greater than politics, that healing was coming, just not through royal power or political manoeuvring. The miracle would not come from a palace, but from a prophet. It would not be arranged through diplomacy, but through divine intervention. The king of Israel was right that he could not heal Naaman, but he was wrong to think that meant no healing was possible. He simply was not looking in the right place. Chapter 4. The prophet's unexpected response. When Elisha the prophet heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes in distress, he sent word. The message was simple and direct. Why have you torn your robes? Send Naaman to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. There is confidence in that statement, a certainty that comes not from arrogance, but from faith. Elisha knew what the king did not, that God's power was not limited by human inability, that miracles were not the province of politics but of prayer, that healing was available to anyone, even a foreign commander, if they were willing to receive it on God's terms. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Picture the scene, a military commander accustomed to leading armies, now standing at the threshold of a prophet's dwelling. The contrast would have been stark. Naaman's entourage would have been impressive, designed to command respect and attention. The horses and chariots alone would have announced his importance, the thunder of hooves and wheels declaring that someone significant had arrived. His retinue would have included servants and guards, advisors and attendants, all the trappings of power and prestige. But Elisha's house was just a house, nothing grand or impressive, no palace or temple, just the dwelling of a prophet who lived simply and trusted God completely. Naaman waited at the door. A commander does not wait often. He commands, and others move. He speaks, and people listen. He arrives, and doors open. But here he stood, at the threshold of a simple prophet's dwelling, waiting like any other petitioner, his status and wealth temporarily irrelevant. And then came the insult, though Elisha likely did not intend it as such. The prophet did not come out to meet him. He did not greet this powerful foreign commander with the respect Naaman was accustomed to receiving. There was no ceremony of welcome, no acknowledgement of his status, no show of honour appropriate to a man of Naaman's rank. Instead, Elisha sent a messenger, an intermediary, someone to deliver instructions second-hand, as if Naaman were just another person seeking help rather than a commander of armies. The messenger's words were even more shocking in their simplicity. Go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be clean. That was it. No grand ceremony, no elaborate ritual, no dramatic laying on of hands or invocation of divine power, no recognition of the journey Naaman had made, the wealth he had brought, the risk he had taken in coming to enemy territory. Just water, just obedience, just the Jordan River, a muddy stream that could not compare to the great rivers of Damascus. 7 times, no more and no less. The instruction seemed almost dismissive in its simplicity. Go wash, as if leprosy were dirt that could be rinsed away, as if healing were as simple as bathing, as if the terrible disease that had driven Naaman hundreds of miles from home could be cured by something anyone could do, something that required no special skill or knowledge or power. The very ordinariness of the instruction was offensive to a man who had travelled far and brought much, who expected something extraordinary, something worthy of his suffering and his status. Chapter 5. The offence of simplicity. Naaman went away angry. The biblical text does not soften this. It does not say he was disappointed or confused or thoughtfully considering his options. It says he was angry, furious, rage-filled at what he had just experienced. You can picture the scene. A decorated commander, face flushed with indignation, turning his chariot around, his entire entourage witnessing his humiliation. The horses would have stamped and snorted as the reins were jerked hard, the chariots wheeling about in the dirt outside Elisha's house. the whole impressive procession preparing to leave as abruptly as it had arrived. He had expected Elisha to come out to him, to emerge from the house with appropriate reverence for who was calling. He had expected the prophet to call on the name of the Lord his God in some impressive display of spiritual authority. He had expected Elisha to wave his hand over the spot where the leprosy marked his skin, to perform some mystical gesture that would demonstrate power and produce healing. He had expected theatre, drama, something befitting the journey he had made and the wealth he had brought, something worthy of a commander. Instead, he got instructions to bathe in a river. The disappointment must have been crushing. After all this, after the servant girl's promise and the king's letter and the long journey and the fortune and gifts, after putting his hope in this foreign prophet and risking his dignity by seeking help in enemy territory, he was being told to do something so simple that it felt like mockery. Worse, he was being told to do it in the Jordan River, a waterway that Naaman clearly considered inferior to what he knew from home. Are not the Abana and Pharpar rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? He fumed to anyone within earshot. He was not wrong, at least not from a purely aesthetic perspective. The rivers of Damascus were famous for their clarity and beauty, fed by mountain springs, running clean and cold through the Syrian landscape. The Jordan River, by contrast, was muddy and warm, winding through the hot valley between Israel and the territories east of it. Nothing special to look at, nothing that would seem to possess healing properties. Could I not wash in them and be cleansed? Naaman demanded. It was a rhetorical question born of frustration, but it revealed the heart of his struggle. If healing were just about water, any water should do. If it were just about washing, he could wash at home. The fact that Elisha had specified the Jordan River made the whole thing feel arbitrary, like a test designed to humiliate rather than heal, like Elisha was exercising power just to prove he could, making Naaman jump through hoops for the prophet's own amusement. His servants watched as their master's pride nearly cost him everything. They had travelled with him, had witnessed the hopes he had carried, had seen him vulnerable in ways that commanders rarely allow themselves to be seen. And now they watched as he stood at the very edge of a miracle, so close to healing that he could almost touch it. Yet his expectations, his sense of what he deserved, his need for something grander and more impressive, almost sent him home unchanged, uncured, defeated not by leprosy but by his own pride. Pride has a way of doing that. It convinces us that God's methods are beneath us, that simple obedience is insulting, that we deserve something grander, something more complex, something that requires us to demonstrate our worth through difficulty, rather than receiving grace through simplicity. Pride tells us that easy things cannot be valuable, that if healing does not cost us effort and pain and struggle, then it cannot be real. Pride makes us walk away from miracles because they do not arrive in the package we expected, because they do not honour us in the way we think we should be honoured, because they require us to humble ourselves in ways that feel degrading to our sense of self. Naaman's anger was pride wounded by simplicity. He wanted to earn his healing through something difficult, something that would showcase his strength and determination. He wanted the healing to be impressive enough that it matched his status, complicated enough that not everyone could receive it, exclusive enough that it confirmed his specialness. Instead, he was being offered something free, something simple, something that required nothing from him except the willingness to obey an instruction that made no sense to his rational mind. The servants watched and waited, knowing that what happened next would determine everything. Would their master let pride send him home to die slowly of leprosy? Or would he find the courage to do something small, something that required not physical strength, but spiritual humility, not military prowess, but simple faith? Chapter 6. The Servant's Wisdom. Naaman's servants approached him carefully. They knew their master's temper, had seen it flare on battlefields when plans went awry, or soldiers failed to execute orders precisely. They knew the danger of speaking to a man whose pride had been wounded, whose anger was radiating off him like heat from a forge. In the social hierarchy of the ancient world, servants did not contradict their masters, did not offer unsolicited advice, did not presume to correct the thinking of those above them. But these servants did something remarkable. They chose to speak anyway, with the kind of gentle wisdom that can only come from those who have nothing to lose and everything to hope for. "My father," one of them said, using a term of respect that acknowledged Naaman's authority, while also claiming a kind of familial relationship, a bond that gave them the right to speak truth. "If the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it?" The question was perfectly crafted, cutting through Naaman's anger to reach the logic beneath it. Of course he would have done something great. That was the whole point. Naaman had travelled hundreds of miles precisely because he was willing to do whatever it took to be healed. He had brought a fortune in gifts because no price was too high. He had risked his dignity by seeking help from a foreign prophet because he was desperate enough to try anything. "How much more then," the servant continued, "when he tells you to wash and be cleansed?" The logic was undeniable, and the servants knew it. They were not asking Naaman to reconsider something difficult. They were pointing out the absurdity of refusing something easy. If he was willing to do great things, why would he refuse to do small things? If he was willing to undergo elaborate rituals or painful procedures or demanding tests of endurance, why would he reject a simple instruction to wash in a river? The very ease of it should have been a gift, not an insult. Their words carried a wisdom that transcended their social status. They understood something that Naaman, in his anger and pride, had missed, that the difficulty of a task has nothing to do with its effectiveness, that God's power is not measured by the complexity of the method, that healing does not require elaborate procedures to be legitimate. They understood that Naaman's real struggle was not with the Jordan River, but with his own expectations, not with Elisha's instructions, but with his own need to feel that he had earned what he was about to receive. Think about what these servants were doing. They were risking their master's wrath to save his life. They could have remained silent, could have let Naaman's pride carry him home to certain death, could have avoided the potential punishment that comes from speaking uncomfortable truth to power. But they chose to speak because they cared more about Naaman's healing than about their own safety. They chose wisdom over silence, truth over deference, love over fear. This is what true servants do in every age and in every context. They speak truth when truth is needed, even when it is risky. They offer wisdom when wisdom is lacking, even when it might be rejected. They care more about the well-being of those they serve than about protecting themselves from potential consequences. These servants embodied a kind of loyalty that went deeper than mere obedience to orders. They were loyal to Naaman's ultimate good, even when that meant contradicting his immediate wishes. Sometimes the people closest to us see more clearly than we do. They see past our anger to our need, past our pride to our pain, past our stated reasons to our actual fears. They understand that what we say we want is not always what we actually need. They recognize that our objections are often symptoms of deeper struggles, that our anger is often a mask for fear or disappointment or shame. And when they love us enough, they risk telling us what we need to hear rather than what we want to hear. Naaman stood at a crossroads, the kind that comes to all of us at various points in our lives. Would he listen to the servants who spoke wisdom? Would he let their logic penetrate his pride? Would he choose to see their intervention not as further humiliation, but as an act of grace, an opportunity to step back from the edge of a terrible mistake? The servants had done their part. They had spoken. They had offered a way forward. Now it was up to Naaman to decide whether he would humble himself enough to take it. And sometimes listening to those who serve us, hearing the wisdom of those we might be tempted to dismiss because of their social status or their lack of formal authority, saves our lives. Not just physically, though sometimes that too, but spiritually and emotionally and in all the ways that matter. The servants could not heal Naaman's leprosy. They could not perform miracles or change water into something medicinal. But they could do something equally important. They could speak truth that cut through pride and pointed toward obedience. And in that moment, that was exactly what Naaman needed. Chapter 7. The Act of Humility. Naaman went down to the Jordan River. That simple sentence contains a universe of internal struggle and spiritual transformation. Can you imagine that walk from where his servant spoke to him to where the river ran? Each step was a choice to humble himself, to release his expectations, to trust that God's way might not match his own. Each step was a death to pride and a birth of faith, a movement away from what made sense according to the world's logic, toward what made sense only in the logic of grace. The water was unremarkable when he reached it, the river ordinary, the whole scene lacking any sense of ceremony or significance. There were no trumpets announcing a miracle, no gathering of prophets to witness the healing, no crowd to observe and validate what was about to happen. Just Naaman and his servant standing at the edge of a muddy river in enemy territory, about to do something that felt foolish by any normal standard. He went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times as the man of God had instructed. The first immersion must have been the hardest. The water was warm and brown, nothing refreshing or cleansing about it by ordinary standards. Naaman would have felt the mud between his toes, the current pulling gently at his body, the weight of his own doubt pressing down on him like a physical thing. He went under, came up, looked at his skin. Nothing had changed. The leprosy was still there, marking him, claiming him, unmoved by mere water. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing changed. The servants watched from the bank, perhaps wondering if they had been wrong to encourage this, if they had led their master toward false hope and deeper disappointment. 4 times. 5 times. Still the leprosy remained, stubbornly present, seemingly mocking the whole exercise. Each immersion without visible result must have tested Naaman's fragile faith a little more, must have made the instruction to complete all 7 seem increasingly absurd. 6 times, and his skin looked the same as it had when he arrived in Israel. At this point, Naaman had done more than most people would. He had humbled himself, had followed the instruction, had immersed himself over and over in water that seemed to do nothing. If healing was going to happen, surely it would have happened by now. Surely 5 or 6 times would be enough if any number would be enough. The temptation to stop, to decide that this was not working, to let anger and disappointment and frustration take over again, must have been intense. But Naaman went under a 7th time. He completed the instruction exactly as it had been given, not stopping at 6 because that seemed like enough, not adding an 8th because 7 had not immediately produced results, but simply obeying the word of the prophet with precision. He went under the surface of the Jordan one more time, felt the water close over his head, perhaps prayed, or perhaps simply hoped, or perhaps just mechanically followed through because he had come this far and might as well finish. And when he came up from that 7th immersion, something had happened. His flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. The leprosy was gone, completely, not improved or reduced or stabilized, but gone. His skin was not just healed, but renewed, transformed, made fresh and whole in a way that went beyond mere absence of disease. The text says it became like that of a young boy, suggesting not just healing, but rejuvenation, not just cure, but restoration to a state of health and vitality that he might not have known for years. The miracle he had travelled so far to find came not through grand ritual, but through simple obedience. 7 times in ordinary water, 7 acts of humility, 7 moments of choosing trust over pride, faith over logic, obedience over expectation. The number 7 carried significance in Hebrew thought, representing completion and perfection, and here it represented the completion of Naaman's journey from pride to humility, from sickness to health, from skepticism to faith. Think about what this meant. The healing came not in the first immersion, not in the moment of initial obedience, but in the completion of the instruction. If Naaman had stopped at 6, he would have gone home still sick, would have concluded that the prophet was a fraud and that faith in the God of Israel was misplaced. But he persisted. He trusted. He completed what he had been told to do, even when it seemed pointless, even when nothing appeared to be happening, even when every rational part of his mind must have been screaming that this was a waste of time. And in that persistence, in that commitment to complete obedience rather than partial obedience, in that willingness to look foolish if necessary, but to follow through on what God had commanded through the prophet, Naaman found healing. Not because the water of the Jordan had special properties, but because God had chosen to work through that water, in that place, at that moment, in response to obedience that required Naaman to lay down everything that had defined him, his pride, his expectations, his need for control, his insistence that healing come in a way that honoured his status. The servants on the bank must have erupted in amazement and joy when Naaman emerged from the seventh immersion with new skin. They had been right to speak. Their wisdom had saved their master's life. But more than that, they had witnessed a miracle, had seen with their own eyes that the God of Israel was real and powerful and willing to heal even a foreign commander who had barely begun to understand faith. They had stood at the edge of the ordinary and watched it transform into the extraordinary, had seen a muddy river become the site of divine intervention, had witnessed proof that God's ways are not human ways, and that miracles come through obedience rather than through impressive ceremonies. Naaman himself must have stood in the water for a long moment, looking at his hands, his arms, touching his face, examining every inch of skin that had been marked by disease and was now clean. The relief would have been overwhelming, the gratitude profound, the sense of having received something he could never have earned or purchased or achieved through his own strength absolutely clear. He had come seeking healing and found it, but not in the way he expected, not through the means he anticipated, not in a manner that confirmed his assumptions about how God works. He found healing through humility, through the willingness to do something small and seemingly insignificant, through obedience that required him to trust what he could not understand. And in that moment, standing in the Jordan River with clean skin and a transformed heart, Naaman became more than just a healed man. He became a living testimony to the power of simple faith, to the grace of a God who meets us in our need and heals us in ways that strip away our pride and build our trust, to the truth that sometimes the greatest miracles come wrapped in the most ordinary packages. Chapter 8. Healing beyond the physical. Naaman returned to Elisha, but he was a different man than the one who had left in anger just hours or perhaps days before. The journey back to the prophet's house was not the same as the journey away from it. Where there had been rage, there was now wonder. Where there had been disappointment, there was now gratitude. Where there had been wounded pride, there was now humble faith. He and all his attendants went back to the man of God and stood before him, and this time there was no impatience, no expectation of grand ceremony, no anger at being made to wait. When Elisha came out to meet him this time, or perhaps when Naaman was invited inside, the commander spoke words that revealed just how deep his transformation had gone. "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel," he declared. This was not a casual acknowledgement or polite gratitude. This was a confession of faith, a theological statement that marked a complete shift in Naaman's understanding of the divine. He had grown up in Arama, surrounded by temples to various gods, living in a polytheistic culture where different deities were thought to have different domains and different powers. He would have known the names of these gods, would have participated in rituals honouring them, would have assumed that each nation had its own deities who fought alongside their armies and blessed their endeavours. But now, having experienced the power of the God of Israel firsthand, having been healed through means that made no sense except in the context of divine intervention, Naaman was making an exclusive claim. Not just that Israel's God was powerful, but that Israel's God was the only true God, that all other deities were false or impotent by comparison. His healing had become more than physical. Something had shifted in his understanding of the divine, in his relationship with ultimate reality, in his grasp of how the universe actually works. He'd come seeking the cure of his body and found something deeper, a transformation of his soul. The leprosy that had marked his skin was gone, but something even more significant had happened. The spiritual blindness that had kept him from recognizing the true God had been healed as well. He could see now, not just with physical eyes, but with spiritual perception, that he had encountered something real and true and powerful in a way that transcended all his previous religious experiences. He had encountered a God who did not need his wealth, who did not require his status, who did not operate according to the rules of power and prestige that governed Naaman's world. This was a God who healed through humility, who worked miracles through obedience, who restored not just flesh but faith. This was a God who could not be manipulated or controlled or purchased, who gave freely rather than in exchange for payment, who required nothing but trust and obedience and a willingness to lay down pride. Naaman's confession was all the more remarkable because of who he was and where he came from. He was not a nobody. He was not someone whose opinion carried no weight. He was a commander, a man of influence and authority, someone whose words would be reported back to his king and would be repeated among the soldiers who served under him. His confession of faith in the God of Israel was a political statement as much as a personal one, a declaration that would have consequences beyond his own life, that would raise questions and eyebrows and perhaps even tensions in the polytheistic culture he was about to return to. But Naaman did not seem concerned about any of that. He had experienced something real, and he was not going to hide it or downplay it or translate it into terms that would be more acceptable to his culture. He stood before Elisha and spoke the truth as he now understood it. There is no God in all the world except in Israel. It was a bold claim, an exclusive claim, the kind of claim that transforms everything about how a person lives and thinks and relates to the world around them. This is what real healing does. It does not just fix the immediate problem, it transforms the person who receives it. Physical healing is wonderful, necessary, life-changing in its own right. But when physical healing opens the door to spiritual transformation, when the miracle of restored flesh leads to the miracle of restored faith, when the God who heals the body also captures the heart, that is something even more profound. That is the kind of healing that lasts not just for the remainder of a lifetime, but for eternity. Naaman had come to Israel as a pagan seeking a cure from a prophet rumoured to have power. He was leaving as a believer, someone who had encountered the living God, and would never be the same. His skin was clean, yes, but his soul was cleansed as well. His body was restored, but his spirit was awakened. He had been made whole in every sense of the word, healed not just physically but spiritually, restored not just to health, but to right relationship with the divine. And this dual healing, this transformation that touched both body and soul, was the real miracle. The clean skin was evidence of God's power, but the changed heart was evidence of God's grace. Anyone with enough power could heal skin, at least theoretically, but only God could transform a proud commander into a humble believer. Only God could take a pagan soldier and make him into a confessor of faith. Only God could use something as simple as water and obedience to remake a person from the inside out. Chapter 9. The refusal of payment. Naaman urged Elisha to accept a gift from him, to take some portion of the vast wealth he had brought on the journey. "Please accept a present from your servant," he said, using language that indicated his changed perspective. He was no longer demanding recognition as a powerful commander. He was presenting himself as a servant, humble before the prophet and the God the prophet represented. In Naaman's world, in the culture and context he knew, this made perfect sense. It was the only way he knew how to respond to such a profound gift. Everything in Naaman's experience suggested that healing should be paid for. When physicians treated illness, they were compensated. When priests performed rituals, they received offerings. When anyone provided a service, especially a service as valuable as restoring health and saving a life, payment was expected and appropriate. Money was how value was acknowledged, how gratitude was expressed in concrete terms, how debts were recognized and honored. For a man like Naaman, who had access to significant wealth and understood the world primarily through transactions and exchanges, offering payment was not just polite but necessary. Moreover, Naaman had brought all this wealth specifically for this purpose. The 750 pounds of silver, the 150 pounds of gold, the 10 sets of fine clothing, all of it had been packed and transported with the expectation that it would be needed, that healing would come at a cost, that the prophet would rightfully expect compensation for such a valuable service. To return home with all of it still in his possession would seem strange, wasteful, almost insulting to the prophet who had facilitated his healing. But Elisha refused. "As surely as the Lord lives whom I serve, I will not accept a thing," the prophet said. The oath was strong, invoking God as witness to his refusal, making it clear that this was not a matter of negotiation or polite refusal that could be overcome with insistence. This was a firm no, grounded not in pride or in some attempt to appear above material concerns, but in a deep theological principle. And even though Naaman urged him, pressed him, tried to convince him to take at least something, Elisha would not relent. He would not take it. This refusal was itself a teaching moment, a lesson as important as the healing itself. Elisha was making a point, demonstrating something crucial about the nature of what had just happened. Healing was not a transaction. It could not be purchased, could not be earned, could not be reduced to an exchange of goods and services. What Naaman had received was not the result of the prophet's skill or power, but of God's grace. Elisha was merely an instrument, a messenger, someone through whom God had chosen to work. To accept payment would be to suggest that the healing had been Elisha's doing, that it was something he had provided through his own abilities, something for which he deserved compensation. But that was not true, and Elisha would not allow Naaman to misunderstand what had happened. The God of Israel could not be bought. His miracles were not for sale. His grace could not be purchased with silver or gold or fine clothing or anything else humans might offer. What Naaman had received was a gift, pure and simple, freely given, requiring nothing but faith and obedience, and the only appropriate response was gratitude and changed living, not payment. This was radically different from the religious systems Naaman knew. In the pagan temples of his homeland, everything had a price. Want the gods to bless your crops? Bring an offering. Want to ensure victory in battle? Make a sacrifice. Want healing or protection or prosperity? Pay the priests, bring the gifts, perform the rituals, and maybe, if the gods were pleased, you would receive what you sought. Religion was transactional, a system of exchanges where humans gave things to the gods in hopes of receiving blessings in return. But the God of Israel did not operate that way. He gave freely. He healed because he chose to heal, not because payment had been offered. He worked miracles out of grace, not in response to bribes or payments or attempts to purchase his favour. Elisha's refusal to accept anything from Naaman was a demonstration of this principle in action. It was a way of saying, this healing was not about what you brought or what you can offer. It was about God's power and your willingness to trust and obey. That is all that was required. That is all that will ever be required. The refusal must have been uncomfortable for Naaman. It left him with a debt he could not repay, a gift he could not reciprocate, a feeling of owing something that he had no way to settle. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that discomfort was itself instructive, teaching Naaman something about grace that he could not have learned if Elisha had accepted payment. Grace leaves us in debt. It gives us something we cannot earn and cannot repay. It places us in a position of permanent gratitude, of ongoing recognition that we have received what we did not deserve and could never have purchased. And that is exactly where God wants us to be. Not trying to earn what has been freely given, not attempting to pay for what was offered as a gift, not reducing our relationship with the divine to a transaction where we give and receive in equal measure. Instead, living in the awareness that we have been given something precious without deserving it, that we have received grace we cannot repay, that the only appropriate response is a life lived in gratitude and obedience and continued trust in the God who heals freely. Elisha's refusal was an act of prophetic teaching. A moment of instruction that went beyond words to demonstrate in action what grace actually means. The prophet would not compromise this principle, not even to be polite, not even to make Naaman comfortable, not even to accept wealth that could have been used for good purposes. The point was too important. The lesson was too crucial. What Naaman had received was a gift, and gifts are not purchased. They are received with gratitude, and then they transform how we live. Chapter 10. A changed life. Before Naaman left, he made an unusual request, one that reveals just how deep his transformation had gone, and how seriously he was taking his new faith. "If you will not accept a gift," he said to Elisha, "then please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry." The request might seem strange to modern ears, but it made perfect sense in Naaman's cultural context. "For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord," he continued, explaining his reasoning. He wanted soil from Israel, actual dirt to take back to Aram so he could worship the God who had healed him on the very ground where that God was known and honoured. In the ancient world, gods were often thought to be connected to specific territories, to have power in particular lands and among particular people. Naaman's request for Israelite soil suggests he wanted to create, in his homeland, a small piece of Israel, a space where the God of Israel could be properly worshipped even in foreign territory. It was a beautiful, almost childlike faith. There was something pure and earnest about it, a desire to do everything right, to honour God in the way he understood would be most appropriate. Naaman was trying to figure out how to live as a believer in the God of Israel while returning to a land filled with other gods, other temples, other expectations. He was attempting to work out the practical implications of his newfound faith, to create a way to worship that would honour what he had experienced while acknowledging the realities of where he lived and what his position required of him. Naaman also acknowledged the complexity of his situation with remarkable honesty. "But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing," he said. "When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." He was describing his official duties, the ceremonial obligations that came with being commander of the army and advisor to the king. When the king of Aram went to worship in the temple of Rimmon, a Syrian god, Naaman would be required to accompany him, to physically support the king as he bowed, and in doing so, Naaman himself would have to bow as well. This was not hypocrisy or a lack of commitment. This was the honest struggle of someone trying to figure out how to live faithfully in a context that did not support that faith, how to honour God while fulfilling obligations to an earthly king, how to navigate the tension between internal belief and external requirements. Naaman was not asking for permission to continue worshipping other gods. He was asking for understanding regarding actions he would be required to perform as part of his official duties, actions that might look like worship but that he was committing in his heart to not treat as such. Elisha's response was brief and gracious. "Go in peace." The prophet did not condemn Naaman for the complexity of his situation. He did not demand that Naaman immediately resign his position or refuse his duties, or create a dramatic confrontation with his king. He simply blessed him and sent him on his way, trusting that a man whose faith was sincere enough to ask these questions was a man whose faith would continue to grow and deepen over time. So Naaman left, transformed in every way that mattered, physically restored, his skin clean and healthy like that of a young boy, free from the disease that had been slowly destroying him, spiritually awakened, having encountered the living God and committed himself to worshipping only that God, no matter how complicated that commitment might be in practice. Emotionally renewed, having experienced grace that healed not just his body, but his sense of worth, and his understanding of how the universe works and his relationship with the divine. He left carrying as much Israelite soil as 2 mules could bear, a literal and symbolic piece of Israel that he would take home and use to create a space for worship. He left with a new understanding of God that would shape the rest of his life. He left with a story he would tell, a testimony of healing that would spread, that would be remembered, that would echo through the centuries as an example of what happens when pride gives way to humility, when expectation gives way to obedience, when a powerful person becomes humble enough to receive what they cannot earn. The man who had arrived in Israel proud and sick departed humble and healed. The commander who had expected impressive ceremony discovered that miracles come through simple obedience. The pagan who had known many gods found the one true God. And all of it happened because a servant girl spoke truth, because servants offered wisdom, because a prophet refused to be impressed by wealth and status, because Naaman finally humbled himself enough to wade into a muddy river 7 times, and because God chose to pour out grace on someone who could not earn it and did not deserve it, but was willing to receive it on God's terms rather than his own. Epilogue: the power of simple obedience. The story of Naaman and the river reminds us that God's instructions may seem small, even insignificant, when measured against our expectations and our sense of what is appropriate or effective or impressive. 7 times in a muddy river. That was all it took. That was the sum total of what was required for a miracle that changed everything. But those 7 immersions required something harder than any great deed, something more challenging than any elaborate ritual, something that many people, then and now, find almost impossible. The willingness to lay down pride, to trust what we do not fully understand, to obey when obedience seems beneath us or pointless or unlikely to produce results. Humility unlocks healing that pride keeps locked away. This is true not just for physical healing, though Naaman's story demonstrates that truth powerfully, but for every kind of healing we might need. Emotional healing often requires the humility to admit we're not okay, to seek help, to be vulnerable with others about our struggles. Relational healing requires the humility to acknowledge our part in conflicts, to apologize even when we think we're only partially at fault, to extend forgiveness even when it feels undeserved. Spiritual healing requires the humility to recognize that we cannot save ourselves, that we need grace we cannot earn, that God's ways are higher than our ways and his thoughts higher than our thoughts. Pride tells us we deserve better, that we should wait for something more impressive, that simple obedience is beneath people of intelligence or status or capability. Pride makes us like Naaman at the door of Elisha's house, angry that the healing does not come with appropriate ceremony, offended that what is offered does not honour our sense of importance, ready to walk away from miracles because they arrive in packages we do not respect. Pride costs us healing, costs us transformation, costs us the very things we most desperately need, all because we cannot bring ourselves to do something simple. But faith can grow even in foreign lands, even in captivity, even in circumstances that seem hostile to belief. The young servant girl demonstrated this. Taken from her home, living as a slave in the household of her captor, she nevertheless maintained faith in the God of Israel and in the power of that God to heal. Her faith did not depend on comfortable circumstances or on being surrounded by other believers or on having religious freedom. Her faith was a quiet flame that continued to burn regardless of external conditions, and when the moment came to speak, she spoke hope rather than bitterness, healing rather than revenge, faith rather than despair. This is the kind of faith that changes the world, the kind that persists in darkness, the kind that speaks truth even when there is no apparent benefit in doing so, the kind that believes God can work miracles even in the most unlikely circumstances. It is faith that does not wait for perfect conditions before it acts, that does not require everything to be ideal before it hopes, that trusts God's power regardless of the surrounding darkness. And it is faith that we are all called to cultivate wherever we find ourselves, whatever our circumstances, however hostile or foreign or difficult our situation might be. Naaman's healing was not just about restored skin. It was about a restored relationship with the divine, about learning that God's ways are not our ways, that miracles come through obedience more than through ceremony, that sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply doing what we are told, even when it makes no sense to us, even when it seems too simple to be effective, even when our pride screams that we deserve something grander. The healing of Naaman's body was the visible sign of a deeper healing that was taking place in his soul. the transformation that moved him from pride to humility, from expectation to trust, from resistance to obedience. And that transformation is available to all of us, in whatever rivers we are called to enter, in whatever simple acts of obedience we are asked to perform. The specifics will differ. For Naaman, it was 7 immersions in the Jordan. For us, it might be something else entirely, some instruction from God that seems too simple, or too strange, or too humbling to be the path to healing. But the principle remains the same. God often works through the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary, through the simple to achieve the profound, through the humble to manifest the miraculous. Sometimes the path to restoration begins with the willingness to obey what we do not fully understand. We want explanations, we want guarantees, we want to know why and how and what will happen if we comply. But faith does not always come with those assurances. Sometimes faith means taking the first step into the river without knowing what will happen, immersing ourselves once, then twice, then 3 times, persisting even when nothing seems to be changing, trusting that if God said 7 times, then 7 times is what will accomplish the healing we need. The river waits. Not the literal Jordan, perhaps, but whatever river God is calling each of us to enter, whatever simple act of obedience we are resisting because it does not match our expectations or honour our sense of importance, or seem adequate to address the magnitude of our need. The river waits, and the healing is there, ready to be received, available to anyone willing to humble themselves enough to obey. All that remains is the question: will we humble ourselves enough to receive it? Will we be like Naaman at the door of Elisha's house, angry and resistant and ready to walk away? Or will we be like Naaman in the Jordan River, humble and obedient and willing to complete what we have been instructed to do, even when it makes no sense, even when it seems pointless, even when pride tells us we deserve something better? The choice is ours. The healing is available. God's grace is offered freely, requiring nothing but trust and obedience, asking only that we be willing to lay down our expectations and pick up simple faith, that we be willing to enter whatever river we are called to enter and immerse ourselves as many times as we are told, trusting that God knows what He is doing even when we do not. And if we can find that humility, if we can muster that obedience, if we can persist through the first 6 immersions when nothing seems to be happening and trust God enough to complete the 7th, we may discover what Naaman discovered, that God is faithful, that His methods work even when they do not make sense, that healing comes to those who are humble enough to receive it on His terms rather than demanding it on their own. May we all have the wisdom of the servant girl who spoke hope when she could have remained silent. May we all have the courage of the servants who spoke truth to power when silence would have been safer. May we all have the humility of Naaman in the river, willing to look foolish if necessary but determined to obey fully, trusting that God's simple instructions are the path to the miracles we most desperately need.